Welcome to Edwardian London, the glittering bridge between the dusty restraint of the Victorians and the roaring chaos of the modern world. It's the early 1800s, and London is putting on its best performance yet. The streets hum with electricity, literally, cars sputter alongside horse-drawn carriages, and the city smells faintly of coal smoke, perfume, and expensive denial. This is the age of elegance, where everything, from architecture to addiction, became dressed in velvet and diamonds. The Edwardians inherited the Victorian obsession with appearances, but traded prudish morality for charm and spectacle. Society had finally exhaled after decades of corseted stiffness. Balls, operas, and garden parties filled the calendar. Everyone was either hosting or trying to get invited. The upper classes moved like peacocks through Mayfair and Kensington, their silk gowns sweeping the filth of progress from the streets. And beneath the music of the waltz and the clinking of champagne glasses lurked something else, something potent, white, and soon to be wildly fashionable. But let's not rush to the needles yet. First, picture the city. London at the turn of the century was both a marvel and a nightmare. Electric lights illuminated the West End, motorcars zipped down Piccadilly, and suffragettes began shouting inconvenient truths in public squares. Yet only a few streets away, poverty festered. In East London, whole families lived in one room. Factory girls coughed their lungs into handkerchiefs, and children worked 12-hour days for the price of a meat pie. This contrast, luxury beside misery, was the defining feature of the Edwardian world. It was progress with a hangover, and no one embodied this contradiction better than the Edwardian elite. They were the most polished generation England had ever produced, and the most anxious. They lived in constant fear of scandal, decline, or boredom, which to them was practically the same as death. They needed something to calm their nerves between the opera and the after-party. Enter the new miracle medicines, soothing syrups, calming powders, invigorating tonics, all perfectly legal and sold with reassuringly scientific labels. Little did anyone realise that the age's greatest luxury wasn't diamonds or Downton Abbey estetol, it was denial, bottled and labelled as cough remedy. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Edwardian obsession with refinement extended to everything. Posture, speech, handwriting, even how one fainted. But beneath the surface the cracks were forming. The pace of change was dizzying. The telegraph had shrunk the world, trains and ships made travel faster, cameras captured faces forever. The upper classes pretended to be in control, but in truth they were hanging on to the past with gloved fingers. The empire was enormous, but anxiety ran deep, about social upheaval, women's rights, and a new century that refused to play by old rules. And where there's anxiety, there's opportunity for both scientists and snake oil salesmen. Medicine was transforming. The old world of leeches and prayer was being replaced by laboratories and pills. Chemistry was the new magic, and the public couldn't get enough of it. If something came in a bottle and sounded vaguely German, it had to be good for you. Patent medicines promised to cure everything from toothache to nervous melancholy. The truth? Many of them were laced with morphine, opium, or the exciting new wonder drug, heroin. But in the first decade of the 1900s, heroin wasn't the villain of the story. It was the hero. Advertised as safe, effective, and non-addictive, it was the modern answer to every ailment that made being human inconvenient. And so the great Edwardian paradox emerged. An age of immense beauty built on quiet destruction. Parlours filled with art and laughter hid drawers filled with syringes and powders. Women with perfect posture and pearls often depended on their nerve tonics to get through the day. Men exhausted from pretending to run the world took morphine for their digestive concerns. It was all terribly civilized, until it wasn't. The social hierarchy helped keep the secret. If a duchess fainted at a ball, it was considered delicate. If a factory worker collapsed, it was disgraceful. Addiction was invisible as long as it wore silk, and that was perhaps the cruelest irony of the Edwardian era. The more refined life became, the more people depended on chemical help to endure it. Yet you can't deny the glamour. London glowed, literally and figuratively. Electric lamps cast warm hellos over marble hotels, and every evening the city shimmered with the sound of orchestras and the rustle of gowns. People felt they were living in the most advanced age in history, the dawn of a new golden century. They had cars, telephones, moving pictures, and medicine that made you feel invincible. What could possibly go wrong? In this glittering world, heroin fit right in. It was elegant, modern, scientific, everything the Edwardians adored. It soothed the anxious, comforted the grieving, and turned sleepless nights into dreamy oblivion. No one yet realised the cost, for now the age of elegance was in full swing, and the city buzzed with optimism, invention, and just the faintest scent of morphine powder drifting from Mayfair to Whitechapel. The Edwardian dream sparkled, but it wasn't built to last. Like the chandeliers that lit its grand ballrooms, it was beautiful, brilliant, and destined to shatter. If you were an Edwardian Londoner in search of relief, glamour, or just a good excuse to spend money, the pharmacy was your new best friend. Forget the grim apothecaries of the Victorian age. The Edwardian drugstore was reborn as a glittering temple of modern science, with gleaming glass jars, polished brass scales, and promises that sparkled brighter than the crystal decanters on display. The druggist was no longer a dusty old man grinding herbs in a back room. He was a respectable merchant of miracles, part scientist, part salesman, and part confessor for a nation addicted to both elegance and escape. Step inside an Edwardian chemist's shop, and you'd be greeted by the scent of rosewater, menthol, and optimism. Behind the counter, rows of colourful bottles lined the shelves. Tonics, powders, pills, elixirs, and ointments, each more enticing than the last. There was something for every ailment. Nervous exhaustion, female weakness, indigestion, melancholy, and that ever-popular Edwardian diagnosis, a general lack of pep. The label designs were miniature works of art, ornate scrollwork, noble fonts, and names like Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne or Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. They sounded trustworthy because, well, they sounded important, and they worked. Oh, did they work? Because beneath the elegant packaging lay the not-so-secret ingredient, drugs that could make you forget what was wrong with you, or for that matter, what century it was. Morphine and opium were common bases for painkillers. Cocaine was sprinkled into toothache drops and throat lozenges, and heroin, the newcomer on the block, was marketed as a medical breakthrough. A century before energy drinks, the Edwardians were already high on scientific progress. The chemist was the gateway between modernity and oblivion. Customers came in for medicine but left with mood enhancers, all wrapped in the comforting language of health. Housewives bought tonics that made afternoon chores feel more tolerable. Clerks used invigorating drops to survive long hours. Even children were dosed with soothing syrups to make bedtime blissfully quiet. Everyone was medicated, they just didn't know it yet. But here's the thing. In Edwardian London, addiction didn't look like a scandal. It looked respectable. The middle class had an insatiable faith in science and an equally strong fear of doctors' bills. The chemist offered a perfect middle ground, affordable, anonymous, and conveniently legal. No awkward examinations, no moral judgment, just a knowing smile and a bottle that promised to fix your nerves, your digestion, your marriage, or all three. Advertising helped seal the deal. Drug companies flooded newspapers and shop windows with glowing testimonials. Restores vitality, cures nervous melancholy, recommended by physicians everywhere. Physicians who were often being paid per word. The public didn't see pills as vice. They saw them as modern miracles. Medicine was fashionable, even luxurious. And like everything fashionable in Edwardian London, it was also deeply performative. The shop interiors reflected this new aesthetic. Counters of polished mahogany, mirrors to reflect light from chandeliers, and attendants in spotless white coats who made you feel as though you were buying something more important than medicine. You were buying control over your life. Pharmacies competed to outshine one another, becoming miniature cathedrals of self-improvement. One could stroll in for a bottle of cough syrup and leave with a perfume, a hair tonic, a morphine-laced sedative, and the smug satisfaction of being thoroughly modern. And the variety! There were powders for indigestion of the spirit, bitters for mental fatigue, and tablets for unproductive mornings. A phrase that, in hindsight, probably describes 90% of the Edwardian workforce. Some chemists even carried imported specialties, Viennese nerve pills, Parisian slimming tablets, or the very latest American heroin cough pastilles. The shelves were an atlas of global temptation, proving that empire wasn't just about tea and spices, it was also about the worldwide distribution of really bad medical ideas. But what made the Edwardian drugstore truly revolutionary was its accessibility. It democratized indulgence. The upper class could afford private doctors and prescriptions, but now even the working poor could wander in and buy a bit of relief. For a few pennies, anyone could taste the promise of ease. A liquid vacation from life's problems. It was in many ways the first taste of mass consumer addiction. Affordable, respectable, and devastatingly effective. And let's not forget cosmetics. The pharmacy was also the birthplace of the modern beauty industry. Face creams, hair tonics, and powders were displayed beside laudanum tinctures and cocaine toothache drops. Because why shouldn't your complexion look radiant while your bloodstream hosted a narcotic parade? Vanity and vice shared a counter. The same bottle that erased your wrinkles could probably erase your short-term memory. What's fascinating and darkly funny is how perfectly this mirrored the Edwardian psyche. They wanted progress without consequences, beauty without effort, and health without moderation. The drugstore delivered all three, sealed and labelled. To buy medicine in this era was to participate in a performance of modernity. You weren't just curing yourself, you were affirming your place in a civilized, forward-thinking empire, where even your pain was handled with sophistication. Of course, no one yet suspected that this shiny new institution was quietly manufacturing a nationwide dependence. The word addiction was reserved for drunks and gamblers. A bottle from the chemist, however, was respectable, until it wasn't. But that reckoning was still to come. For now, the elegant jars glowed in the gaslight, promising comfort, confidence, and just enough chemical courage to get through another day of progress. The Edwardian pharmacy had reinvented not just medicine, but desire itself. It was where modern consumer culture met the ancient human craving for escape, a marriage made in mahogany and morphine. By the dawn of the 20th century, science had a swagger. Laboratories were the new cathedrals of progress, and chemists were treated like prophets, white-coated alchemists turning suffering into comfort, one bottle at a time. And in 1898, one of those laboratories, belonging to the German pharmaceutical company Bayer, made what it proudly called its greatest discovery, a new medicine that promised to change the world. They named it heroin. Yes, that Bayer. The same company that would later sell aspirin. Back then, Bayer was chasing a grand idea, a painkiller as powerful as morphine, but without the pesky addiction problem. Morphine had been the 19th century's darling drug, the universal cure, from childbirth to heartbreak, until doctors realised it had a rather annoying side effect called dependency. Patients who started on morphine rarely stopped. They needed something cleaner, safer, more heroic. So Bayer's chemists tinkered in their gleaming laboratories in Elberfeld, experimenting with opium derivatives until they stumbled upon something new, diacetylmorphine. When they tested it, the results were euphoric, literally. The testers reported feeling energized, fearless, and blissfully pain-free. One scientist described feeling heroish, the German word for heroic, and thus heroin was born, a name so bold it practically wrote its own marketing. Within months, Bayer began distributing this wonder drug worldwide. The advertisements were polished, scientific, and soothingly authoritative. Heroin, they promised, was a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine, gentle enough for children, reliable enough for doctors, and refined enough for the drawing room. It came in elegant amber bottles, often with gold labels and neat instructions like, for coughs, colds, bronchitis, and general malaise. The Edwardians, a society that adored refinement, couldn't resist. Heroin soon became the ultimate respectable remedy. Doctors prescribed it for everything: asthma, insomnia, anxiety, menstruation pain, nervous exhaustion, even irritability. Cough, take heroin. Melancholy, heroin. You stubbed your toe? Let's not take chances, heroin. It was sold as lozenges, syrups, powders, and injections, often paired with phrases like scientifically proven and recommended by experts. The experts, of course, were the same people making a fortune from selling it. For mothers, heroin was a miracle. Edwardian households often relied on tonics and syrups for everyday ailments, and heroin-based cough syrups became staples in bathroom cabinets. Ads showed cherubic children sleeping peacefully after a spoonful of Bayer's newest creation, blissfully unaware that they were being gently narcotized. Soothes the throat, calms the nerves, the label read. And it did. It soothed, it calmed, and it hooked. Doctors too were delighted. They could now offer a medicine that worked spectacularly well and carried no stigma. Unlike opium dens or patent elixirs sold by street peddlers, heroin came wrapped in scientific respectability. It was German-engineered health. The word itself sounded strong, noble, the opposite of frailty. The Edwardians were obsessed with self-control and decorum, and heroin gave them both. It dulled pain without the visible vice of alcohol and elevated mood without the messy hangover. You could maintain your composure and still feel magnificent. Bayer, of course, capitalized on this. Their catalogues portrayed heroin as the future of medicine, the pinnacle of pharmaceutical progress. In one particularly glowing 1901 medical journal ad, heroin was called the perfect sedative for coughs and irritations, preferable to morphine for its safety and dependability. Doctors were even encouraged to give free samples to build trust, and trust they did. Millions of prescriptions poured out across Europe and America. But the irony was already brewing. Reports of strange dependencies began surfacing within a few years. Patients complained of needing larger doses for the same relief, of feeling weak without their medicine, of losing energy and sleep when they tried to stop. Yet few connected the dots. After all, this wasn't opium from some shadowy den. It was medicine from Bayer. The marketing genius of heroin was that it transformed a vice into virtue. Addiction was reframed as chronic treatment. Patients weren't addicts, they were loyal users, and the drug fit perfectly into the Edwardian worldview. Modern, elegant, visible. It didn't disrupt society, it soothed it. The same genteel hands that held champagne flutes could now discreetly hold heroin lozenges, and no one would bat an eye. Even more astonishingly, heroin was exported globally, from London and New York to Bombay and Tokyo. British doctors prescribed it liberally in colonial territories, spreading what they believed was the gift of European medical progress. In reality, they were exporting a chemical time bomb wrapped in civilization's packaging. It took less than a decade for the illusion to crack. By the early 1910s, some doctors began whispering concerns. Patients were returning again and again for refills. Withdrawal symptoms, they called them, though the term withdrawal hadn't yet entered polite vocabulary. What was happening to all these calm, compliant patients? They were learning the hard way that the so-called non-addictive miracle had inherited morphine's worst traits and amplified them. But in the early years of its reign, heroin was a star. It embodied everything the Edwardians believed about themselves: modern, advanced, humane, and just a little bit smug. The tragedy was that it worked too well. For a brief, glittering moment, heroin promised a painless world. and no one noticed that the price of painlessness was, quite literally, their peace of mind. As one 1902 British doctor cheerfully wrote, "Heroin is the perfect medicine. It never fails to calm, and the patient always requests more." History would soon reveal just how right he was, and how disastrously wrong. The Edwardian upper class was many things, charming, cultured, exquisitely dressed, but above all it was bored, painfully, extravagantly bored. You can only attend so many garden parties, balls and fox hunts before existence starts to feel like an endless loop of champagne and ennui. And while the newspapers called it society life, what it really was, beneath the pearls and polite applause, was a relentless performance. Every smile was rehearsed, every gesture choreographed, every conversation a duel fought with wit and wine. Maintaining that level of perfection was exhausting. Fortunately, there was something to help, a discreet little chemical companion that could keep your mood high and your manners flawless. In the drawing rooms of Belgravia and the grand hotels of Mayfair, morphine and heroin became the quiet co-stars of Edwardian civility. Nobody called it addiction, they called it maintenance. After all, the body needed its little boosts, didn't it? The doctor prescribed it, the chemist delivered it, and society accepted it, or at least pretended not to notice. These substances slipped seamlessly into polite society because they looked so harmless. Delicate glass bottles with elegant fonts, as refined as perfume. You didn't have to sneak around alleys to take them. You could keep them right on your vanity next to your rouge and pearls. For women particularly, these drugs fit perfectly into the rhythm of upper-class life. A lady's schedule was filled with invisible burdens, the social anxiety of being watched at every moment, the suppression of every real emotion, the need to remain composed even when your corset was fighting for your last rib. Emotional restraint was mandatory, and pharmaceuticals offered an elegant shortcut to serenity. Feeling nervous before a dinner party, a few drops of morphine, struggling through another tedious luncheon, a spoonful of nervine tonic. Couldn't sleep after pretending to enjoy a symphony. Heroin syrup, naturally. Doctors, of course, encouraged this chemical etiquette. They assured their wealthy patients that these medications were gentle restoratives, particularly beneficial for hysterical nerves, the diagnosis given to women who were simply tired of pretending to be statues. One physician wrote approvingly that heroin promotes good humour and sociability without the ill effects of spirits. In other words, it made you delightful without making you loud. What could be more perfect for a society that valued poise above all else? At soirees and salons, this quiet dependency turned into a kind of invisible fashion. While gentlemen debated politics over cigars, the ladies passed around delicate silver flasks containing cough elixirs and restorative tonics. Some even carried decorative inhalers, beautifully crafted like jewellery, which allowed them to take a genteel breath of relief without mussing their hair. "It's for my nerves," they would murmur, a phrase that in Edwardian English could mean anything from "I'm anxious" to "I'm currently high as a kite." The men were hardly immune. Business magnates, aristocrats, and military officers, all paragons of discipline and self-control, monsieur, used the same remedies for fatigue and digestive irregularities. These were the men who could command armies but not endure a headache without a morphine tablet. Many swore it sharpened their focus and steadied their hand for fencing or shooting. One London club reportedly kept a doctor on call to administer gentle relaxants before high-stakes card games. The line between medicine and recreation blurred as smoothly as the evening's brandy. But perhaps the most seductive element of all was discretion. The Edwardian upper class adored secret. It was practically their favourite form of intimacy. Morphine and heroin fit right in, offering private pleasure with no visible scandal. You could be the picture of composure in public while privately chasing chemical serenity. There were no slurred speeches or staggering steps, just a soft glow of calm, the kind that made your conversation sparkle and your smile seem mysteriously effortless. If your dinner party lacked charm, well, you probably hadn't inhaled enough sparkle dust. This was also the age of performance, not just in the theatre but in life itself. Women performed gentility, men performed strength, everyone performed happiness. And performance is exhausting. The drugs didn't create joy, they manufactured it on demand. A few milligrams of modern chemistry could transform social dread into confidence, anxiety into elegance. It was emotional tailoring, invisible but perfectly fitted. Of course, as with all fashionable habits, competition crept in. Some hostesses became known for their refreshing gatherings, where guests always seemed to leave a little too relaxed, a little too serene. Behind the velvet curtains, small trays of soothing powder made the rounds, a genteel indulgence, whispered about but never admitted. It was all so respectable, so carefully staged. And the irony was delicious. While reformers raged about gin and pubs, the most refined homes in London were quietly floating on morphine dreams. The effects weren't always subtle, though. Some chronic users developed what doctors politely called languor, a fashionable weakness that looked poetic in candlelight but less so in daylight. Society mistook the early symptoms of dependency, drowsiness, mood swings, vacant smiles, for evidence of refinement. She's so sensitive, people would say of a woman who was in truth one dose away from withdrawal. The line between graceful melancholy and chemical fatigue became impossible to tell. But Edwardian London wasn't ready to confront that reality yet. For the elite, morphine and heroin weren't vices, they were invisible armour, elegant shields against the emptiness of too much leisure and too little purpose. The servants cleaned, the chauffeurs drove, the orchestra played, and society drifted serenely through a haze of laudanum and opiates, never admitting that beneath the sparkle lay dependence. In this glittering world, everyone sparkled, not because life was easy, but because science had invented a way to pretend it was. Step into the Edwardian household and open the medicine cabinet, or, more accurately, the mahogany display cupboard, politely pretending not to be one. Inside you'll find the silent lifeblood of the home, bottles upon bottles of shimmering liquids, powders and syrups. The labels are decorative, the promises are bold, and the ingredients, best not to ask too many questions. Welcome to the golden age of tonics, where health came in a bottle and soothing often meant chemically induced serenity. For the Edwardian woman, tonics were as essential as tea. Between the corsets, endless social obligations, and the gentle art of pretending not to be exhausted, every household had a stockpile of syrups for female weakness, nervous distress, and the ever-vague hysteria. These concoctions were not prescribed by shady back-alley peddlers. Oh no, they were advertised in the Illustrated London News, Ladies' Home Journal, and even in fashion magazines. The same issue that told you how to host the perfect afternoon tea might also inform you that Mrs. Grantley's calming cordial could soothe all your problems for just 2 shillings a bottle. The ingredients? A delightful cocktail of opium, alcohol, chloroform, and sometimes a touch of morphine or heroin, all perfectly legal, of course. These tonics promise to quiet your nerves, brighten your complexion, and make you the best version of your delicate self. They were the Edwardian equivalent of both antidepressants and skin serums, self-care, but with a chemical kick. Mothers relied heavily on these bottled miracles. Between managing the household, raising children, and navigating a society that insisted women must be graceful at all sometimes, it's no wonder that nervine tonics became as common as sugar. Advertisements specifically targeted women with lines like, "For the weary mother, the delicate daughter, the anxious wife," in other words, for anyone with a pulse and responsibilities. Cough syrups were among the most popular. The Edwardian winter was brutal. Coal soot thickened the air, and tuberculosis was an uninvited houseguest. A spoonful of syrup promised instant relief, and it delivered, because it was usually laced with codeine or morphine. Housewives would pour a measure before bed, smile faintly at the warm, floating calm, and wake up believing they'd simply slept well. Children, too, were not spared from soothing syrups. These gentle infant pacifiers were marketed to help restless babies sleep, and they worked. Too well. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup famously advertised itself as perfectly harmless. Its key ingredients? Morphine and alcohol. Harmless, perhaps, if you never woke up to read the fine print. But to understand why these potions thrived, you need to grasp how Edwardians viewed illness. Health was a performance, especially for women. You were expected to look pale, because pale meant refined, but not too pale, that meant dying. A tonic let you walk that line beautifully. Too tired to attend a garden party? A dash of debateman's drops, sleepless after a long evening of pretending to care about small talk. Gowan's night syrup would fix that. Feelings of melancholy? Mother's friend tonic elixir. 10% alcohol, 90% wishful thinking. Tonics weren't just medicine, they were a lifestyle. Bottles gleamed beside silver hairbrushes and porcelain powder jars. Taking one wasn't shameful, it was sophisticated. Advertisements showed elegant women reclining on fainting couches, a soft smile on their lips, clutching their favourite bottle of relief. The message was clear. Modern women didn't complain. They consumed. What's more, these potions carried the seductive illusion of control. A woman couldn't vote, couldn't inherit freely, and often couldn't even choose her husband. But she could choose her tonic. It was a tiny rebellion wrapped in decorative glass. The apothecaries' shelves gave her access to her own little empire of comfort, numbness, and independence from the emotional labour of Edwardian perfection. And oh, the variety! There were bitters for digestive vigour, syrups for female bloom, and tonics for nervous clarity. Each claimed to be the key to vitality, longevity, and improved moral outlook, which is impressive considering most of them were indistinguishable from liquid anaesthesia. It's also worth noting the role of alcohol. Many health tonics contained more gin than a London tavern. One popular recipe, Peruvian bark tonic, was roughly 30% ethanol, a fact cheerfully omitted from its label. Middle and upper class women could sip these daily without violating the social codes that frowned upon drinking. After all, this wasn't gin. It was medicine. By 6 p.m, half the drawing rooms in London were quietly awing to the rhythm of their own prescribed regimens. The humour and the tragedy lies in how completely society trusted these concoctions. The word medicine carried divine authority. Nobody questioned the ingredients because progress was sacred. Science had delivered miracles before: electricity, photography, anaesthesia, so why shouldn't bottled bliss be the next triumph? If it came with a polished label and a doctor's name, it must be good for you, and if you weren't sure what was in it, well, it probably worked. The chemists and advertisers understood human psychology perfectly. They weren't selling chemicals, they were selling hope. The promise that you could sip away your exhaustion, anxiety, or despair, and still be the flawless, charming creature society demanded. Every bottle whispered, "You deserve rest." And for a fleeting narcotic moment, women believed it. The tonics and syrups of Edwardian London were more than remedies. They were mirrors reflecting the pressures of their age. They revealed a society that demanded constant grace from women, but offered no real relief except the kind you could drink. Before social media influencers and wellness gurus, there was Edwardian advertising, a world where ink and imagination could sell anything from corsets to cough syrups. The early 1900s were a golden age for marketing, when trust in science met blind faith in beauty, and the result was a printed wonderland of lies so elegant you almost wanted to believe them. Picture it: London's walls, trams, and newspapers bursting with posters of glowing women in flowing white gowns, holding bottles of miraculous elixirs that promised to restore youth, cure melancholy, and make you positively radiant, inside and out. The copywriters of the Edwardian era were poets in lab coats, masters of making poison sound like poetry, and nobody wielded their pens more effectively than the pharmaceutical companies. The new scientific age had given medicine a makeover. Gone were the crude, hand-painted signs of apothecaries and snake oil salesmen. Now the language of health was wrapped in Latin phrases and elegant typography. Bottles bore names like Dr. J. H. Kell's Vital Elixir or the Heroin Restorative, adorned with gold leaf labels that practically sparkled with respectability. Chemically pure, scientifically formulated, and approved by physicians became the buzzwords of the day. No one ever specified which physicians, but in an era obsessed with class and credentials, the word itself worked better than chloroform. Everywhere you looked, advertising promised vitality. Posters depicted cherubic children clutching syrup bottles, women regaining their bloom, and men standing tall with renewed vigour. The tone was always the same. You are one purchase away from perfection. One magazine ad for a morphine-laced tonic promised to restore the verve of youth and the peace of contentment. Another declared, "No home should be without this household marvel," which was true if your household goal was a chemically induced nap. And the imagery. Edwardian ads didn't shy away from grandeur. Bottles floated on clouds, attended by angels or muses offering heavenly blessings, a sight that would make modern regulators faint. One particularly surreal poster for a popular opiate mixture showed a glowing mother cradling her baby, with the caption, "Her sleep is sweet, her child's dreams are peaceful." In reality, both were under the soothing influence of morphine, but never mind, the typography was divine. Advertising was more than commerce, it was storytelling. The Edwardians loved a good narrative, and marketers delivered. They told tales of tired clerks transformed into titans of industry, frail women reborn into social butterflies, and elderly men restored to youthful spirits. The message was consistent. Science had triumphed over suffering. You could bottle happiness, and better yet, it came with a label. But perhaps the cleverest move was how these ads blurred the line between medicine and lifestyle. The Edwardians were obsessed with the idea of being modern, of keeping up with progress, and taking the latest tonic became as much a social statement as wearing the newest hat. Advertisers understood this perfectly. They sold not just relief, but identity. "Refined families trust this remedy," one addie boasted. Translation: if you don't, you're uncultured. Magazines aimed at women were especially rich with these contradictions. Between recipes for sponge cake and guides to refining one's complexion, readers would find glossy ads for Bayer's heroin lozenges or Mrs. Winslow's syrup for the family's comfort. The tone was reassuring, the typography genteel, and the message disarmingly maternal. These weren't dangerous drugs. They were acts of love. Mothers were told that a spoonful of syrup showed care. Husbands were told that gifting their wives a bottle of tonic showed devotion. It was emotional manipulation wrapped in floral borders. Even the newspapers joined in the illusion. Medical endorsements appeared beside advertisements, often indistinguishable from real articles. "A cure for modern nerves," one headline read. Beneath it, a glowing review of a morphine-based product by Dr. A. Somerton, London. Dr. Somerton, it later turned out, didn't exist, but in print his authority felt real enough to empty chemists' shelves. For the advertisers, morality was secondary to aesthetics. A medicine that made you dependent was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity for repeat customers, and so they crafted their dream carefully. Clean fonts, angelic faces, and gentle promises. Nothing says health like an angel holding a bottle of opiates. Of course, behind the visual serenity was chaos. Addiction rates were rising, but marketing only intensified. When critics began whispering about dependency, advertisers shifted the strategy. They didn't deny the rumours, they reframed them. If taken responsibly, one campaign assured, these medicines restore balance. The trick was simple. When questioned, claim it's the user's fault. It's a marketing tactic that still hasn't gone out of style. What made these ads so effective was how beautifully they played into Edwardian ideals: purity, refinement, self-control. The posters didn't show slums or sickness. They showed glowing families, confident men, and angelic women. It wasn't about curing disease anymore. It was about perfecting humanity. The Edwardian dream of progress found its perfect symbol: a bottle of chemical bliss. sold with divine lighting and flawless smiles. And it worked spectacularly. Sales soared. Entire companies built fortunes on slogans and sentimentality. By the time anyone began to question the safety of these miracle elixirs, the market had already changed society itself. People didn't just believe in the products, they believed in the fantasy they sold. That progress meant comfort, that science meant safety, and that health could be designed like fashion. Advertising had created not just consumers but disciples. In Edwardian London, health wasn't just a state of being, it was a performance. And in this grand performance, women had a very specific role: to be delicate, pale, and perpetually on the verge of fainting. Strength was unseemly, energy was unfeminine, and robustness was practically a character flaw. The ideal woman floated through life like a vaporous angel, ornamental, ethereal, and preferably reclining. If you could collapse gracefully at least once a week, congratulations, you were fashionable. It wasn't always this way. The Victorians had already flirted with the idea that fragility was feminine, but the Edwardians perfected it into an art form. The Gibson girl, that impossibly tall, slim-waisted creature from magazines, became the template for beauty, elegant, self-controlled, and always a little breathless. Her enormous hat, her swan-like neck, and her waist strangled by 20 inches of whalebone created a look that screamed refinement and whispered help. The corset played a starring role in this cult of fragility. It wasn't just a garment, it was a social declaration. The tighter your laces, the higher your status. Breathing freely was for factory workers. True ladies were expected to sacrifice a lung or two in the name of beauty. Fashion magazines gave them cheerful advice like, if faintness occurs, have a maid loosen the stays slightly and apply lavender water. Translation: collapse first, adjust later. The goal was to look like you were constantly one swoon away from meeting your ancestors, but to do it gracefully. And swoon they did. Fainting couches, those elegant chaise longues you see in Edwardian drawing rooms, weren't just decorative. They were practical survival gear. Society women fainted at dinner, fainted in church, fainted while trying on hats. A woman could even faint strategically, using it as a social weapon. Uncomfortable question: faint. Unwanted suitor? Faint. Someone spilled gossip about your cousin's affair? Faint and reset the conversation. It was emotional control disguised as helplessness. But fainting wasn't just fashion, it was also ideology. The Edwardian upper class idolized feminine delicacy as proof of moral and social superiority. The ability to be weak was paradoxically a luxury. If you could afford to faint, it meant you had servants to catch you. If you could afford to be too nervous for work, it meant someone else was working for you. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, even illness was class-coded. Pale skin, for instance, was a mark of privilege. It meant you weren't toiling outdoors. The only tan acceptable in 1905 was from your evening gaslight. This cult of fragility also shaped medical trends. Doctors prescribed rest cures for women suffering from nervous exhaustion, which covered everything from anxiety to simple boredom. The treatment? Stay in bed, eat bland food, avoid reading or conversation, and definitely don't think too much. Women who tried to protest were told that their resistance was a symptom of their condition. Many patients emerged from these cures more desperate than when they started, but they looked serene, which was all that mattered. Some took it even further. There was a trend, especially among fashionable women, of boasting about delicate constitutions. Having a mysterious ailment was a social accessory, like owning a small dog or a French hat. Magazines published letters from women describing their symptoms in loving detail, often ending with, "My physician recommends a mild tonic and absolute rest." The implication was clear: they were too refined for this rough, bustling world. Meanwhile, women of the working class, who had neither the time nor the resources to indulge in fragility, were condemned as coarse or unfeminine. They were strong because they had to be, and society punished them for it. The double standard was breathtaking. The same society that praised a duchess for fainting in a carriage scolded a laundress for standing on her feet all day. Weakness, it turned out, was only beautiful when it came with a dowry. The fashion industry fed this illusion mercilessly. Gowns were designed to exaggerate fragility, high collars to elongate the neck, puffed sleeves to narrow the arms, skirts so heavy they required assistance to move. Women were encouraged to walk slowly, speak softly and smile faintly, as though the air itself were too stimulating. Even perfume advertisements promised scents suitable for those of sensitive temperament. Everything about Edwardian femininity was engineered to look fragile. Even the furniture seemed to sigh under the weight of it all. Of course, not every woman bought into it. Behind the scenes, suffragettes were busy smashing windows, chaining themselves to railings, and proving that fragility was optional. But in polite society, their rebellion was treated as a medical concern. Newspapers described them as hysterical, and doctors diagnosed political mania. The cult of fragility wasn't just fashion, it was a tool of control. A fainting woman was easy to admire. A shouting woman was a public menace. Still, for those trapped in the social ritual, the rewards were seductive. Fragility earned sympathy, attention, and, most importantly, admiration. To be delicate was to be desirable. To be robust was to be unfashionable. Women learned to weaponize weakness, to turn passivity into power, and as long as they could faint attractively and recover photogenically, society applauded. In the end, the Edwardian woman was both prisoner and performer, corseted by expectation, pampered by illusion, and praised for her perfect fragility. She could barely breathe, but she could do it beautifully. In Edwardian London, a respectable doctor was not just a healer, he was a high priest of modern science. His word was law, his pen was sacred, and his handwriting was completely illegible. But what truly gave him power wasn't the stethoscope or the medical degree hanging crookedly on the wall, it was his prescription pad. With one graceful flourish, he could turn a bottle of heroin from dangerous narcotic into legitimate medicine. And once that paper slipped across the counter, no one questioned what came next. Doctors, you see, were in the business of relief, and business was booming. Their patients were exhausted by progress. Too much speed, too much stress, too much pretending everything was fine. Heroin and morphine, freshly sanctified by science, promised instant calm and absolute compliance. If a woman couldn't sleep, she was prescribed heroin powder for nightly discomfort. If a man had digestive issues, morphine tinctures were considered essential tonics. If a child was restless, there was always a drop of soothing syrup. Every problem fit a diagnosis, and every diagnosis had a drug that felt like a miracle. The irony, of course, was that few of these doctors saw themselves as dealers. They were professionals, after all, educated, ethical, and profoundly unaware of how many of their patients were quietly spiraling into addiction. When morphine dependency appeared, it was seen as a moral weakness of the patient, not a side effect of treatment. The dosage must have been misused, doctors said, often while writing another prescription. The denial was immaculate. Part of the problem was how medicine itself had changed. The Edwardians were living in the first age of industrial pharmaceuticals. Drugs no longer came from local apothecaries with hand-measured ingredients. They arrived in neat bottles from laboratories, stamped with factory precision and medical authority. To prescribe them was to join the march of progress. No more messy folk remedies or guesswork. Now there were formulas, dosages, and glossy pamphlets written by the manufacturers themselves. The doctor simply followed instructions from the scientific experts, and everyone felt very modern about it. And those experts, pharmaceutical companies, knew exactly how to keep doctors loyal. They courted them like prize clients, sending free samples, invitations to luncheons, and gifts disguised as medical tools. A typical letter might read, "We are pleased to provide your esteemed practice with our new heroin tablets. We trust you will find them both gentle and reliable for the nervous and the sleepless." In plain English, Here's the latest legal addiction. Enjoy the repeat business. The arrangement worked beautifully. Doctors maintained their dignity, chemists made steady profits, and patients returned again and again, faithful as churchgoers, for their refills. It was a perfect triangle of trust, greed, and ignorance, and within that triangle lay the foundation of a nationwide dependence problem that nobody was prepared to acknowledge. Pharmacists, for their part, became quiet millionaires. They stood at the crossroads of medicine and commerce, the middlemen between suffering and solution. The most successful druggists in London weren't necessarily the most skilled, they were the most discreet. They kept records in elegant ledgers, never asked too many questions, and made sure their deliveries arrived with the same punctuality as the post. For many customers, the chemist was more confessor than merchant. He knew who was anxious, who was sleepless, who was delicate, and who was buying an awful lot of cough syrup for someone without a cough. Even the prescriptions themselves became a form of social theatre. Ladies would glide into pharmacies clutching their doctor's note like a holy relic. No one dared suggest impropriety. After all, the paper bore a physician's signature. It wasn't indulgence, it was self-care. For men, particularly those in respectable positions, the prescription provided a moral shield. No matter how dependent they became, the presence of that small white slip preserved their reputation. The real addiction wasn't just to the drugs, it was to respectability. And when patients began showing symptoms of dependency, trembling hands, clouded moods, an inability to function without treatment, doctors found convenient explanations: nervous exhaustion, constitutional weakness, or the always popular female sensitivity. The medical establishment was so steeped in its own authority that they couldn't imagine being wrong. The notion that medicine itself could create illness was unthinkable. The prescription pad had become a symbol of control, and like all symbols of control, it concealed chaos beneath its clean surface. But make no mistake, some doctors knew exactly what they were doing. There were quiet whispers about physicians who built fortunes catering to London's elite, offering private prescriptions for unusual symptoms. For a generous fee, they would visit your townhouse, diagnose you with stress of the nerves, and leave behind a few vials of bliss disguised as treatment. Their patients adored them. A miracle worker, society called them. And in a way they were. They made pain disappear, at least for a few hours. Yet beneath this elegant facade of professional care, the trapdoor was always waiting. The more a patient relied on these medications, the more they needed them. Each new prescription deepened the dependency while preserving the illusion of health. Doctors believed they were restoring balance, but in truth, they were merely postponing collapse and billing for it. The prescription pad, in all its neat respectability, was the century's most elegant trapdoor. Eventually, but as murmurs of concern spread, a few brave physicians began questioning the practice. They noticed that the same patients kept returning, weaker and wearier than before. Some even tried to wean their patients off the drugs, a process that often ended in panic, relapse, or ruin. But the majority preferred not to look too closely. Denial was the cheaper cure, and so the elegant conspiracy continued, built not on malice but on mutual self-deception. The doctors didn't think of themselves as dealers, the chemists didn't think of themselves as profiteers, and the patients didn't think of themselves as addicts. Everyone played their part perfectly, and no one had to admit what was really happening. If you picture Edwardian high society, you probably imagine champagne pyramids, waltzing couples, and polite gossip over canapes. But as the century tipped toward its most decadent years, some soirees swapped the bubbly for something smoother, and far more dangerous. Welcome to the inhalation evening, the city's quietest scandal. The setting was always impeccable. A Mayfair drawing room with heavy velvet curtains, polished floors, and a faint scent of roses, mingled perhaps with something a bit more chemical. Guests arrived in silk and tuxedo, greeted not by clinking glasses, but by the whisper of a silver case opening. Inside lay slender glass tubes, small spoons, or even medical inhalers, the latest continental novelty. Conversation stayed hushed, not because of propriety, but because everyone was too blissfully sedated to raise their voice. In these exclusive circles, morphine and heroin were not seen as vice. They were refinement. Alcohol was gauche, unpredictable and noisy. A lady could not stumble, but she could recline languidly, eyes half closed, murmuring that she felt simply celestial. The host would smile knowingly and instruct the maid to dim the lamps. It wasn't debauchery. It was science with silver spoons. The custom began discreetly among a few adventurous aristocrats. They claimed it started as medical recreation, a way to explore the powers of the new modern tonics outside of dreary clinics. One duchess, famous for her restorative gatherings, described her events as social experiments in tranquility. In practice, it was tranquil indeed. Guests would gather around low tables, passing crystal droppers and delicate inhalers while a pianist played Debussy softly in the corner. No shouting, no drunken laughter, just the serene hum of collective oblivion. For the bored elite, these nights were revolutionary. The Edwardian social calendar was exhausting. Opera openings, charity balls, luncheons, teas, and endless conversations about weather and waistlines. A morphine party offered something radical: stillness. The sensation was both intimate and luxurious. People claimed to see sound, taste colour, or experience a grand hush of the soul. And unlike the scandalous gin dens of the lower classes, these affairs had impeccable manners. No one smoked from dirty pipes or passed out on the carpet, at least not without style. Servants were instructed to treat the entire affair as a medical exercise. Footmen brought trays of chilled water and linen cloths. Maids stood by with fans in case anyone's complexion grew too poetic. The butler, of course, maintained plausible ignorance. The house rule was, if you didn't see it, it didn't happen. When the session ended, the same guests who moments before had been drifting in chemical bliss would rise, straighten their gloves, discuss the latest parliamentary scandal as though nothing unusual had occurred. But make no mistake, this was no mere curiosity. For some, these soirees became as regular as afternoon tea. Invitations were coveted, whispered about and discreetly distributed. There were rumours of Tuesday inhalations among certain literary circles, where writers and artists swore that a few careful doses unlocked divine inspiration. One poet reportedly composed an entire sonnet cycle under the influence and then spent 3 months trying to remember what it meant. The appeal was easy to understand. Edwardian society demanded constant control of one's body, voice and emotions. Heroin and morphine offered the opposite, a holiday from consciousness. You could finally stop pretending. The drugs dissolved the endless etiquette, the nervous chatter, the masks of civility. For a few fleeting hours, people felt weightless, unburdened by corsets, conversation or consequence. Of course, the illusion had a price. Hosts began noticing their guests arriving earlier and leaving later, or requesting a little extra for the road. Some developed elegant excuses to linger by the sideboard where the vials were kept. The most committed enthusiasts began carrying their own travel sets, small velvet pouches with monogrammed spoons and vials. One fashionable gentleman even commissioned a jeweller to craft a morphine syringe disguised as a fountain pen. Discretion, after all, was everything. Doctors quietly enabled the trend. Since heroin was still considered medicinal, prescriptions were easy to acquire. Nervous strain, insomnia, or the ever-convenient artistic temperament were sufficient justifications. Chemists who supplied high society clientele turned a tidy profit, ensuring that London's grandest drawing rooms stayed well-stocked with pharmaceutical amusements. By 1910, these parties had become an open secret. Gossip columns referred coyly to peculiar gatherings or new entertainments for the weary elite. But scandal never stuck. The participants were too powerful, too charming, and too well-dressed to be accused of anything so vulgar as addiction. If questioned, they insisted that it was a medical experiment, and really, who would argue with a duchess holding a doctor's note? What makes this period so eerily modern is how normal it all seemed. The substances were legal, the hosts respectable, and the results, at least at first, miraculous. Yet beneath the hush of violins and velvet lurked dependency. Guests who once came for curiosity began to come for necessity. The parties grew quieter, the laughter slower, and the attendees paler. What began as escape turned into routine. Still, for a few glittering years, the upper class convinced itself that it had found the perfect vice, elegant, controlled, invisible. While the working classes sought solace in gin palaces, Mayfair found it in morphine, because when champagne fills too loud, they joked, there's always heroin. While Edwardian aristocrats floated through their morphine-laced soirees in silk and silence, another crowd was chasing euphoria on the opposite side of town, louder, poorer, and much more imaginative. Welcome to Bohemian London, where rent was optional, creativity was compulsory, and chemical enlightenment was considered just another art supply. In Soho, Bloomsbury, and the fog-damp streets of Fitzrovia, writers, painters, and poets gathered in smoky rooms filled with cheap furniture, overflowing ashtrays, and endless talk about beauty, truth, and unpaid bills. They lived for art, despised convention, and distrusted anyone who ironed their clothes. Here, the intoxicant of choice wasn't champagne. It was whatever could turn a dimly lit boarding room into the gates of Olympus. The Edwardian era was, after all, the birth of the modern artist, that tortured genius type who starved for art and then died tragically misunderstood. To such souls, sobriety seemed not only dull, but creatively dishonest. Pain was proof of depth, suffering meant sincerity, and drugs, well, drugs meant access. They weren't trying to escape reality, they were trying to improve it. Heroin, morphine, laudanum, and even cocaine drifted freely through London's artistic circles. Poets inhaled inspiration, painters chased visions, and playwrights swore that one whiff of the right medicinal stimulant could turn an empty page into a masterpiece. It wasn't hedonism for them, it were method. As one novelist wrote, before presumably collapsing on his typewriter, to touch the infinite, one must first unbutton reason. The chemistry of creativity was seductive. Morphine softened the edges of despair. Heroin lifted the spirit. Cocaine sharpened the tongue just enough to make every idea sound profound. Artists spoke of seeing sound or hearing colour, and while their descriptions were often nonsense, their conviction was contagious. The line between art and hallucination grew deliciously blurry. In the cramped studios of Chelsea, painters experimented with light, shadow, and laudanum. Their canvases glowed with eerie brilliance, cityscapes bending, figures dissolving into mist, faces melting into clouds of colour. Critics praised their impressionistic modernism. The artists themselves mostly blamed the fumes. One painter was so fond of mixing turpentine with his morphine tonic that his friends joked he was varnishing his insides for preservation. Writers were no better. The cafes of Soho buzzed with men and women convinced they were the next Wilde, Shaw or Yeats, preferably all three. They sipped morphine-laced absinthe, scribbling fragments of genius on napkins and declaring them revolutions in prose. Most of those fragments were unreadable. But occasionally something extraordinary would emerge, an essay or poem pulsing with the feverish rhythm of chemical clarity. For every 100 intoxicated ramblings, one piece would shimmer with brilliance. It was just enough success to keep the myth alive, that art required suffering and suffering required drugs. Publishers, of course, pretended not to notice. A poet delivering verses that smelled faintly of ether was still better than no poet at all. The public romanticised the artistic temperament, imagining every great work was born from chaos and opium dreams. If a writer collapsed mid-conversation, it was eccentricity, If a painter disappeared for a week, he was immersed in vision. Addiction became a performance, part tragedy, part marketing strategy. Women artists, in particular, faced a unique contradiction. They were expected to be ethereal muses but not creative equals. Some used that double standard to their advantage. A few artistic ladies, often actresses or writers, cultivated their fragility into allure. They smoked morphine cigarettes at salons, eyes glistening under low lamplight, declaring that beauty requires a little pain. The men, entranced, mistook dependency for depth. Society called them fascinating. History would later call them victims. Not every Bohemian, however, glamorized addiction. Some genuinely believed they were exploring consciousness itself. The late 19th century had flirted with spiritualism, seances, and mysticism. The Edwardians took that fascination inward. Morphine became their seance. Painters described their art as capturing the soul in motion. Writers spoke of writing from the edge of the void. It sounded noble, even transcendent, until the bills piled up and the tremors began. By 1908, certain corners of London were infamous for their creative dens. Cramped rooms where artists pooled coins for opium or heroin, then collapsed on couches to discuss eternity. Visitors sometimes stumbled upon these gatherings and left both horrified and impressed. The air reeked of ink, sweat, and sweet, smoky decay. The walls were covered in unfinished canvases, and the floors in half-written manuscripts. Yet amidst the chaos, art did happen. Whether from genius or delirium, it hardly mattered. There was also a strange camaraderie to it all. Addiction was a shared experience, a badge of authenticity. You don't understand beauty till you've seen it through a fever, one poet announced at a cafe reading, before promptly fainting into his espresso. The crowd applauded, assuming it was performance art. But beneath the romantic myth, tragedy simmered. Many of those creative souls burned fast and bright, leaving behind haunting fragments of brilliance and half-finished dreams. Morphine gave them transcendence, but it also took their time, their health, and eventually their lives. A painter might spend one glorious week producing his masterpiece, and the next 6 months unable to hold a brush. Inspiration came in a bottle, as one artist later quipped, and usually came with tremors. The irony was exquisite. In trying to escape the monotony of modernity, Bohemian London created something eternal, a culture that celebrated the tortured genius, the romantic addict, the artist who lived too intensely to survive. They didn't just paint and write under the influence, they built a mythology that still haunts art today, that suffering makes creation noble, that genius requires poison, that without pain beauty cannot exist. While the Edwardian elite were fainting gracefully onto velvet sofas and discussing the spiritual benefits of morphine, the working class was enduring a far rougher reality, one that made pain itself a daily companion. In the cramped tenements of London's East End, life was not about etiquette or elegance. It was about survival. And in that world, medicine wasn't fashion, it was fuel. But the poor didn't have access to private doctors or elegant chemists with mahogany counters. What they had instead were patent medicines, cheap, brightly labelled, and available at every corner shop. For a few pence you could buy a bottle that promised to ease the cough, numb the ache, calm the baby and silence your worries. It didn't matter that most of these so-called remedies were made of morphine, opium or alcohol. What mattered was that they worked, at least for a while. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a roaring engine, but it ran on human exhaustion. Factory hands stood for 12 hours at looms and furnaces. Dock workers hauled cargo until their joints screamed. Seamstresses and matchgirls went blind or poisoned from the fumes of their own labour. There were no unions yet strong enough to protect them, no safety laws worth mentioning, and certainly no health insurance. If you fell ill, your choice was simple: work through it or starve. So when a bottle promised instant relief, you didn't ask for details, you reached for your coins. Patent medicine makers understood their audience perfectly. They marketed pain as a personal failure and relief as self-respect. "Don't let weakness cost you wages," declared one popular ad for Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne, syrup packed with opium and chloroform. It was sold as a cure for every complaint known to man, which was true if you define cure as rendering the patient too sedated to notice he's dying. Then there were the tonics that promised to strengthen the body and the spirit. Most were 30 to 40% alcohol, which did wonders for the spirit, if not the body. Godfrey's cordial, Mother Bailey's quieting syrup, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, these were household names, especially among the poor. They were the working class equivalent of the aristocrat's chemist bottle, but without the illusion of science or safety. Mothers gave them to fussy children so they could finish their laundry or sleep through the night. Men drank them to silence their aches before returning to the mill. And slowly, imperceptibly, entire families became dependent on these poisons sold as blessings. For many, addiction wasn't indulgence, it was inheritance. A child might grow up drinking soothing syrup daily, her body adjusting before she could even read the warning label if there was one. A mother might rely on morphine to get through the endless fatigue of factory life. A father might take laudanum to numb the pain of injury and keep food on the table. The substances didn't discriminate between classes, but society did. When the rich used heroin, it was called treatment. When the poor did, it was called moral decay. The irony was bitter. The very same companies that sold refined heroin to the upper classes marketed diluted versions to the slums. They slapped cheerful labels on bottles and promised hope in every spoonful. Pharmacies and general stores displayed them prominently, right next to bread and soap. Even church publications sometimes recommended them as merciful aids for the weary. Poverty made skepticism a luxury no one could afford, and London's poor had much to escape from. The East End was a maze of misery, overcrowded rooms, open sewers, polluted air, and endless noise. People slept in shifts because there weren't enough beds. Hunger gnawed constantly, disease spread faster than news, and alcohol offered the only legal anesthesia. Against that backdrop, a bottle of patent medicine wasn't just relief, it was mercy. Even if it took years off your life, it gave you one night of peace. There were darker consequences, of course. Many infants died quietly in their cribs after too much soothing syrup. Coroners in the early 1900s noted a rise in unexplained infant deaths. Failure to thrive was the polite phrase. Adults, too, wasted away slowly, their dependency written on their hollow faces. Yet few connected the dots. How could something sold in every shop, endorsed in every paper, possibly be harmful? It said medicine right on the label. Reformers eventually began to notice. Social workers like those from the settlement movement, women who lived among the poor to understand their struggles, wrote horrified accounts of chemical quiet in the slums. They described mothers half asleep at their sewing machines, children too lethargic to play, and men stumbling home dazed from factory shifts. The hunger of the body, one reformer wrote, has been replaced by the hunger for the bottle that soothes it. But their calls for regulation were drowned out by the louder voice of profit. Even when awareness grew, society preferred to moralize rather than empathize. Newspapers scolded the poor for their weakness of will, as if addiction could be cured by character. Few noticed that the same substances were being consumed by doctors, duchesses, and poets, only in fancier glass. The hypocrisy was staggering. Poverty wasn't a vice, it was simply a condition that left you with fewer elegant excuses. Still, the working-class reliance on patent medicines did more than highlight inequality. It exposed the human cost of progress. Industrial London had created a world where pain was an inevitable byproduct of labour, and comfort came with a chemical price tag. Every drop of relief carried a debt. The poor couldn't afford leisure or luxury, but they could afford oblivion, and for many that was close enough. The price of relief, as one doctor grimly remarked, was often your future. If Edwardian London was floating in a gentle haze of morphine and heroin, it was only because the British Empire had built the largest, most profitable drug network the world had ever seen, and done it in the name of civilization. Behind every soothing tonic and every calming syrup stood an invisible empire of fields, ships, and hypocrisy so vast it could have been measured in tons of irony per shipment. The story began long before the Edwardians, but by their time the system had reached industrial perfection. Britain had cornered the global market on opium, the sticky, powerful resin harvested from poppies. The poppy may have bloomed in Asia, but its profits blossomed in London. From India's fertile plains to China's coastal harbours, Britain's imperial machinery turned addiction into revenue, and pain into policy. It was quite literally an empire built on narcotics. In India, where the East India Company once ruled like a corporate monarch, poppy cultivation was no small affair. Villages across Bengal and Bihar were turned into forced farms for the empire's favourite flower. Indian peasants were required to grow opium instead of food, often under contracts so exploitative that they ended up indebted for life. They didn't call it poppy farming, they called it starvation with supervision. The opium was processed in British-run factories, vast echoing halls where workers packed the brown paste into neat chests, stamped with the East India Company's seal. Those chests were then shipped east, not to Britain, but to China. Because here's the kicker. While Britain's moralists thundered against alcohol and gambling at home, the empire was quietly running a global drug trade abroad. The British government had long known that opium was devastating Chinese society. It didn't stop them, it just made them better businessmen. In fact, when the Qing dynasty tried to ban the import of opium in the 1830s, Britain declared war, twice. The Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, were not about freedom or trade. They were about the right to keep selling drugs to people who didn't want them. The result? Britain forced China to open its ports, pay compensation, and hand over Hong Kong to a gleaming new base for imperial commerce and moral double standards. By the Edwardian era, this colonial pipeline was running smoother than ever. British merchants, Indian labourers, and Chinese addicts formed an unholy triangle of supply, demand, and denial. The poppy fields of the empire kept the factories of Europe supplied with morphine, heroin, and codeine. The same chemicals that powered London's polite addictions were extracted, refined, and exported from colonies that were often addicted to Britain's power itself, and back home no one wanted to talk about it. The newspapers celebrated British scientific progress in medicine, while quietly ignoring where the ingredients came from. The same parliament that wrung its hands over moral decay in London, slums cheerfully pocketed tax revenue from opium exports. Moral outrage, it turned out, was highly selective. Addiction was a tragedy when it happened in Whitechapel, but a triumph of trade when it happened in Shanghai. The empire's hypocrisy was breathtaking. Britain lectured the world about temperance while smuggling narcotics under naval escort. Missionaries arrived in China preaching sobriety, only to find their converts too high on imported opium to listen. One Chinese reformer wrote bitterly, "They bring us poison and call it commerce. They bring us Bibles and call it salvation." He wasn't wrong. The British government justified the trade as a necessary evil, claiming that if they didn't sell opium, someone else would. It was the 19th century equivalent of saying, we're not the problem, but we're just the supplier. And it wasn't only Asia that felt the empire's chemical touch. Morphine extracted in colonial laboratories found its way back into Europe's medicine cabinets. The cycle was perfect. The colonies grew the raw material, British firms refined it, and the profits circled back to fund more imperial civilization. By 1900, the empire was exporting so much opium that even the Victorians, never known for self-awareness, began to blush. India alone was producing over 5,000 tons annually, a staggering figure that made up a major portion of the colonial budget. For the Raj, opium wasn't a vice, it was fiscal policy. Meanwhile, in London's lecture halls, moral reformers railed against the dangers of addiction. They scolded women for their tonics, men for their morphine, and children for their bad habits, while the empire that made those habits possible rolled on undisturbed. No one dared ask where the heroin came from, or how it arrived so cheaply. To question imperial supply chains was unpatriotic. The empire was a machine that turned human suffering into statistics and profit margins. The irony reached absurd levels when British officials began introducing anti-opium reforms in the colonies. They banned local consumption to protect the moral fibre of the natives, but kept exports to foreign markets thriving. In other words, opium was too immoral for Indians to smoke, but too profitable for Britain to stop selling. Apparently, addiction was fine as long as it paid taxes. Even as whispers of regulation began at home, the first murmurs that heroin might not in fact be the miracle cure, the empire continued to feed global supply. British pharmaceutical firms sourced raw opium from their own colonies, refining it into medicines that returned to those same colonies at inflated prices. It was the purest form of economic irony. The colonies grew the pain and then brought back the cure. By the time the Edwardian public began to question the morality of their civilizing mission, it was far too late. Generations of addiction, exploitation and hypocrisy had already carved their place in history. The empire's poppies had bloomed across continents, leaving behind a trail of empty villages, hollow eyes and haunted ledgers that smelled faintly of profit and ether. The British Empire prided itself on order, progress and moral virtue. But beneath the rhetoric lay the simplest truth of all. It wasn't tea, textiles or even railways that made Britain rich. It was drugs. By the early 1910s, the great Edwardian medical miracle was starting to look a little twitchy. Doctors who had spent the last decade prescribing heroin and morphine with the enthusiasm of confectioners were beginning to notice a strange phenomenon. Their patients were not getting better. They were returning, paler, weaker, and far more desperate than before. Sometimes for the same ailment, sometimes for ailments that seemed suspiciously like withdrawal in disguise. The medical profession, so proud of its progress, was about to have an existential hangover. At first, no one wanted to believe it. How could the shining triumphs of modern pharmacology, the drugs that had soothed the nerves of duchesses and healed the coughs of soldiers, possibly be harmful? These were scientific medicines, developed by the world's most reputable laboratories. They came in elegant bottles with tidy instructions. They had Latin names. Dangerous things didn't come with embossed labels and measuring spoons, did they? But the evidence was mounting. Physicians began reporting cases of mysterious fatigue, emotional instability, and chronic nervous exhaustion in patients who were otherwise healthy, apart from their daily dose of the latest wonder drug. One London doctor described a woman who'd been prescribed heroin for a cold and returned months later, suffering from unaccountable weakness and melancholy. Another reported a series of patients whose cures required increasingly larger doses until the treatment seemed to be chasing its own tail. The symptom list, as one exasperated physician put it, started to look suspiciously like the cure. Behind closed doors, medical societies began whispering. Case studies circulated quietly among the more conscientious practitioners. Dependence on morphia, chronic heroin fatigue, unusual sleep disorders. The reports were polite, clinical, and deeply alarming. Patients were exhibiting cravings, irritability, and panic when their medicine ran out, behaviours disturbingly similar to those of the street addicts the upper classes pitied from a safe distance. The profession that had prided itself on eradicating suffering was realising it had merely rebranded it in better handwriting. Of course, not every doctor was ready to admit it. Medicine in the Edwardian era was still as much about ego as evidence, and no one liked to confess that their cure-all had been quietly dismantling their patients' lives. The establishment blamed the victims instead. The patients, they said, must have abused the dosage or been constitutionally weak. The notion that the drug itself might be the problem was simply bad for business, and worse for reputation, yet the data wouldn't stay polite. Hospitals began recording a steady rise in what were euphemistically called habit cases. In Manchester, one physician documented a patient who had been taking morphine as directed for 5 years and now could not function without it. In Edinburgh, A surgeon wrote about a patient whose inexplicable nerve pains turned out to be the body's protest against withdrawal. The more doctors observed, the clearer the pattern became. These weren't isolated misfortunes, they were side effects of an entire era. And the patients weren't just the poor. Many were genteel men and women who had never set foot in a slum. They arrived at clinics with perfect manners and trembling hands, clutching their bottles of nerve tonic like lifelines. "Doctor," they would plead, "I've tried to stop taking it. But the weakness returns." To tell such patients that their illness was self-inflicted was both cruel and unthinkable, and so the polite fiction continued. The prescription pad kept filling, and so did the graveyards. But slowly resistance began to build. A new generation of sceptical doctors, many of them trained in the emerging fields of pathology and pharmacology, began questioning the medical establishment's blind faith in chemistry. They started demanding evidence. What exactly did these drugs do inside the body? How long did they stay there? Could their effects accumulate? The answers were vague, uncomfortably so. The old guard muttered about delicate constitutions, while the new scientists began muttering about toxic dependency. Medical journals, once full of glowing reviews for heroin's soothing and non-addictive properties, began to feature less enthusiastic titles on the persistence of narcotic habits in the medicinally treated and unexpected complications following prolonged morphia use. These were the academic equivalent of alarm bells. The very language of medicine, tidy, formal, and detached, could barely contain the dawning horror that the profession had, in essence, legalized dependency. Pharmaceutical companies responded with impressive slipperiness. They released new pamphlets assuring doctors that, when used judiciously, their products posed no risk of harm. If addiction occurred, it was the result of patient misuse or emotional instability. In other words, the same argument used by tavern owners since the dawn of ale. They even began renaming their products. Heroin quietly disappeared from advertisements, replaced by vague terms like powerful sedatives or scientific analgesics. The goal was simple: erase the name, not the substance. By 1912, the medical backlash had gained enough traction to reach public ears. Newspapers, always eager for scandal, began publishing stories about the new curse of the chemist. Headlines warned of women enslaved by medicine and doctors in dilemma over habit-forming drugs. For the first time, the general public began to suspect that their trusted healers might have been playing with fire and selling it by the teaspoon. The reactions varied. Some doctors grew defensive, retreating into denial. Others quietly changed their prescribing habits. A few brave physicians began trying to treat addicts, though they hardly knew how. Without proper understanding of dependency, their cures ranged from prayer to cold baths to abrupt withdrawal, the medical equivalent of trial by fire. Still, they had taken the first step, admitting the problem existed, and in that uneasy moment of reckoning, the entire Edwardian faith in progress began to wobble. The age that had worshipped science as salvation was discovering that science too could sin. The same minds that had conquered disease and illuminated the night with electricity had also invented dependence in a bottle. The physicians who once saw themselves as heroes were beginning to realize they might be accomplices. Heroin had been born in the laboratory of optimism, a symbol of human mastery over suffering. Now, it was a reminder that mastery can become servitude when knowledge runs faster than wisdom. The doctors had wanted to end pain. Instead, they had only changed its form. By the 1910s, the medical community's growing unease about heroin addiction had begun to leak out of laboratories and hospital wards and into the hands of the press, and once the tabloids caught the scent of scandal, there was no containing it. What had once been whispered in medical circles became screamed from every street corner. The age of the Edwardian moral panic had arrived, printed in bold type and sold for a penny a copy. The early 20th century tabloids were a force of nature, half journalism, half theatre. They'd already perfected the art of turning society's fears into front-page entertainment. Now they had found their dream story, respectable people behaving badly. Addiction had been tolerated when it hid behind closed doors, but when it began spilling into parlours and garden parties, the press pounced. Headlines like "Society Ladies Hooked on Heroin" and "The Curse of the Drawing Room" lit up the morning editions. Suddenly, the genteel image of Edwardian refinement came crashing into the gutter press with all the grace of a fainting duchess. The tone was gleeful moral outrage. The same newspapers that had once carried advertisements for Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup now thundered about the poison of modern life. Hypocrisy, certainly, but in the world of print, outrage sold far better than reflection. The public couldn't resist it. Addiction had always been a problem for the slums, the drunken poor, the hopeless cases, the faceless masses. But now it had acquired pearls and a title. The idea that duchesses and debutantes might be secretly dependent on the same substances as factory girls was too delicious to ignore. Nothing sells papers like rich people doing poor people's problems. Articles described glamorous women ensnared by their prescriptions, their beauty fading under the pale shimmer of dependency. Others claimed that the drug menace had infiltrated our very parlours, with respectable families harbouring what one paper called an epidemic of elegant weakness. Illustrations showed wide-eyed women clutching bottles, their lace sleeves trembling, a perfect blend of scandal and sympathy. Readers could tut disapprovingly while secretly enjoying every sordid detail. Of course, the facts were often optional. Reporters rarely distinguished between morphine, heroin, or opium. All were simply labelled the White Demon. One sensational story claimed that London's West End was infested with secret dens where society women gathered for midnight indulgence. Another alleged that a titled gentleman had been caught smuggling morphine disguised as perfume, proof apparently that no amount of breeding could withstand temptation. Accuracy was irrelevant. Atmosphere was everything. Behind the drama, something real was shifting. The press had made addiction visible. For the first time, ordinary readers were confronted with the idea that dependency could reach across class lines, that medicine itself might be to blame. Some papers even ran cautious editorials questioning whether doctors and chemists bore responsibility. "We are a nation dosed into despair," wrote one columnist. "Our own industry has made misery fashionable," but most newspapers preferred the simpler story: sin, scandal, and social decay. The tabloids weren't just reflecting moral panic, they were manufacturing it. They understood the Edwardian appetite for fear dressed as virtue. Every shocking story came with a sermon attached. "Mothers beware," blared one headline. Beside a lurid drawing of a child reaching for a bottle labelled poison, "This is the fate of the careless." Another article warned that foreign influences were behind the growing drug trade, because naturally, nothing bad in Britain could possibly be homegrown. It was the perfect cocktail of fear and xenophobia, shaken vigorously and served daily with breakfast tea. Even respectable newspapers joined the frenzy. The Times ran editorials about the new moral disease, while the Illustrated London News published exposés filled with tasteful horror. Meanwhile, journalists prowled chemist shops posing as customers, buying bottles of cough syrup and then dramatically pouring them out in front of photographers. The nation's addiction had become a performance, morality sold by the column inch. Yet beneath the public hysteria, the class divide remained painfully clear. When the addicted were poor, they were condemned as degenerates. When they were rich, they were tragic victims of modern living. Society could forgive anything as long as it was done in silk gloves. A dock worker dependent on laudanum was a failure. A lady dependent on heroin was sensitive. The tabloids reinforced this double standard even as they pretended to expose it. Still, the damage was done. What had once been a private ailment was now a national scandal. Social clubs whispered about fallen women of the better sort. Families quietly sent daughters abroad for rest cures. Chemists began hiding their stronger products under the counter, and doctors grew defensive. The public, spooked by headlines, started treating every bottle of cough syrup as a potential time bomb. Even children's tonics were eyed with suspicion. The pendulum had swung from denial to paranoia. Politicians, ever alert to an opportunity for moral leadership, quickly joined the chorus. Parliamentary debates suddenly filled with speeches about protecting the British character from narcotic corruption. There were proposals for tighter regulation, licensing requirements, and public campaigns about purity of the body. The irony, of course, was that many of the same politicians still held investments in companies exporting opium overseas. But hypocrisy rarely sells as well as righteousness. By the mid-1910s, the heroin craze had transformed from a quiet epidemic into a national morality play. The public wanted villains and victims, heroes and warnings. Doctors blamed patients, newspapers blamed foreigners, and everyone blamed modernity. The one thing few wanted to admit was the truth, that the entire system, from empire to chemist to consumer, had been complicit. The moral panic couldn't cure the addiction problem, but it did change how Britain saw itself. The Edwardian dream of progress and purity had cracked. The same empire that prided itself on self-control had discovered its own dependence. And while the tabloids shouted about sin and scandal, a quieter truth was beginning to emerge, that the problem wasn't just chemical, it was cultural. By the time the Edwardian tabloids had whipped Britain into a moral panic over heroin, the nation's police forces were left standing in the middle of the storm, armed with truncheons, top hats, and absolutely no idea what to do. For centuries, London's constables had been trained to handle drunks, pickpockets, and the occasional runaway pig, but now they were being told that the new criminal menace was medicine, and worse, the suspects were polite, well-dressed and rich. The entire concept of drug crime was, at the dawn of the 20th century, as alien to the police as Wi-Fi in a coal mine. The law didn't define heroin or morphine as illegal. They were sold by chemists, prescribed by doctors, and taxed by the government. So when reformers began demanding action against the narcotic scourge, officers had to ask the obvious question, action against what exactly? They could arrest a drunk for singing sea shanties in the street, but a duchess lying blissfully on her fainting couch after her nerve tonic? That was still a grey area, albeit a very expensive shade of grey. Nonetheless, pressure from newspapers and public moralists meant that something had to be done. The newly emboldened purity societies, well-meaning ladies with umbrellas and alarming determination, began staging crusades for national sobriety. They demanded raids on dens of vice, confident that such places were infesting London like fleas. The police, reluctant but dutiful, complied. What followed were some of the most unintentionally farcical investigations in British history. Imagine a small team of bewildered constables creeping into a respectable West End townhouse under cover of night, expecting to find dangerous criminals. Instead, they find a cluster of middle-aged socialites in silk gowns, gently giggling at nothing in particular while a pianist plays Chopin. One officer later recalled, "They were so polite, sir, we didn't know whether to arrest them or ask for tea." The hosts insisted it was a medical gathering, and technically they weren't lying. In the poorer districts, things were less amusing. The same moral crusaders who had wrung their hands over fallen ladies of society now demanded crackdowns in working-class neighbourhoods. The police obliged, raiding chemist shops, lodging houses, and suspicious premises. Most of these dens turned out to be back rooms where exhausted labourers were simply trying to sleep off their doses of patent medicine. But moral reformers needed statistics, not sympathy, and the police were under orders to deliver them. One of the first recorded drug raids took place in 1912, when a team of officers, armed with borrowed medical advice and boundless confusion, stormed a small apothecary in Soho. They seized a few bottles of morphine tincture, a pile of ledgers, and an unfortunate cat that had been asleep on the counter. The newspapers called it a great blow to the narcotic trade. The apothecary was fined for improper record-keeping. The cat was released without charge. The real challenge for law enforcement was that the line between legal and illegal simply didn't exist yet. Doctors could prescribe heroin freely, chemists could sell it over the counter. The only thing resembling a crime was selling medicine without a license, and even that was rarely enforced. So while reformers demanded justice, the police were left enforcing morality rather than law, a task that has never gone well in British history. To fill the gap, authorities began inventing guidelines. Constables were instructed to monitor suspicious behaviour, a definition so vague it might include half of London on a Monday morning. They were told to keep an eye on those who purchased medicine too frequently. Naturally, this led to a few awkward confrontations. Elderly ladies picking up their arthritis tonics found themselves questioned like smugglers. One bemused matron was reportedly asked if she was a habitual morphine user. She sniffed and replied, "Only on Thursdays." Meanwhile, moral reformers continued to provide helpful advice, most of which bordered on fantasy. Pamphlets warned that foreign chemists were flooding the city with dangerous powders, or that clubs of depravity were luring the innocent into sin. None of it was entirely true, but it made for excellent fundraising dinners. The anti-vice movement was a booming business, with committees, speeches and prayer meetings all dedicated to purging the nation's soul one bottle at a time. For the police, however, moral panic created an impossible paradox. They were expected to look decisive but act delicately. Arresting the poor for intoxication was easy. Arresting the wealthy for addiction was social suicide. A constable who dared to detain a gentleman for chemical enthusiasm might find himself reassigned to traffic duty by morning. The law remained politely blind to those who could afford respectability. Still, the raids continued, sometimes symbolic, sometimes sincere. Opium dens in Limehouse, long romanticised by sensational fiction, became easy targets. These places did exist, though far less extravagantly than the papers claimed. In reality, most were dim, cramped rooms where sailors and immigrants sought a few hours of escape. The police dutifully dragged out a handful of dazed patrons each time, while the press proclaimed another victory in the war against drugs. The Empire's conscience was clean again, at least until the next scandal sold more papers. Eventually, Parliament began to realise that moral outrage alone couldn't serve as legislation. Lawmakers drafted the first real regulations around narcotics in 1916, part of the Defence of the Realm Act, a wartime measure that made it illegal for civilians to possess certain drugs without a doctor's prescription. Ironically, this meant the very same medical establishment that had created the epidemic now became its gatekeeper. But at least the police finally had something resembling a rulebook. Until then, the situation remained absurd. You could be arrested for staggering home after too much gin, but being elegantly stoned in your drawing room was still under review. The Edwardians had managed to turn vice into etiquette, and the police were left trying to figure out which fork to use. As Edwardian London descended into moral chaos, or at least as the newspapers said it did, a new kind of performance took centre stage, the crusade. And like all great Edwardian entertainment, it came with costumes, speeches, and an audience ready to applaud itself. The temperance societies, moral reformers, and women's leagues of Britain seized the moment, declaring war on the White Scourge, the genteel epidemic of morphine, heroin, and chemical dependency that had crept from chemists' shelves into drawing rooms. Their solution? A moral spectacle grand enough to rival any West End play. The reformers had been waiting for this chance. For decades they had railed against alcohol, prostitution, gambling, and anything that looked remotely enjoyable. Now, at last, they had found a new villain. One that was modern, medical, and conveniently scandalous. The drug menace, as they called it, combined everything they loved. Righteous anger, moral superiority, and endless opportunities to hold meetings. As one wag put it, nothing motivates moral outrage like running out of gossip. The earliest crusaders came from the temperance movement, those tireless campaigners who believed society could be purified by sheer willpower and an endless supply of pamphlets. They had fought gin and beer, now they turned their attention to the poppy. To them, heroin was simply liquor in scientific disguise, another symptom of human weakness, only this time bottled by respectable chemists instead of brewers. "The devil," thundered one temperance speaker, "has exchanged his barrel for a prescription pad." Meetings were held in church halls where banners proclaimed "Purity is patriotism" and "The body is the Lord's temple, keep it unspotted by chemistry." The rhetoric was fiery, the science non-existent. Reformers showed enlarged photographs of shriveled poppies, ghastly drawings of skeletal addicts, and charts that looked very impressive but proved nothing. Audiences gasped, clutched their pearls, and left feeling deliciously terrified. Few noticed that many of the same people leading these crusades still took their sleeping draughts at night, but hypocrisy, as always, was the cheapest ingredient in moral reform. The women's groups were especially active. Organisations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the National Vigilance Association found in narcotics a new frontier for their moral mission. They saw drug addiction not only as a threat to family health, but also as a symptom of male irresponsibility. And frankly, they weren't entirely wrong. Pamphlets warned of husbands enslaved to morphia and mothers undone by tonics. They framed the crisis as both medical and domestic. The home was under siege, and only righteous women could defend it. Their meetings were elaborate affairs. Imagine rows of impeccably dressed ladies, their hats trembling with feathers, listening intently as a speaker declared that no English child should be raised beneath the shadow of the poppy. There would be hymns, testimonials, and sometimes, if things got dramatic, love's demonstrations. One reformer famously brought a jar of opium to a meeting, held it aloft and declared, "This is the serpent in our midst." The audience gasped. A local chemist later confessed it was probably just molasses. Beyond the lecture halls, the campaign spilled into the streets. Processions marched through towns carrying banners that read, "Britain's honour is at stake," and "Down with the drug dealers of despair." Marching bands played uplifting hymns while children handed out tracts warning that every dose brings death. It was civic theatre at its finest, moral panic choreographed like a parade. Onlookers cheered, not necessarily because they understood the issue, but because nothing brightened a dreary Edwardian afternoon like a good moral rally. The government watched all this with cautious approval. Public pressure made it easier to justify regulation, and reform movements gave politicians a sense of moral momentum without requiring much effort. A few sympathetic members of Parliament even appeared at rallies, giving stirring speeches about the preservation of British virtue. Of course, these same MPs often voted for colonial budgets funded by opium trade revenues, but that was discussed in smaller print. Newspapers loved the spectacle. They sent photographers to capture women waving banners, children singing temperance songs, and reformers handing out pledge cards for citizens to sign. The coverage was glowing. Mothers march against morphine. Ladies lead the fight for purity. The reformers had become celebrities of a sort, moral influencers before Instagram. They didn't need hashtags, they had hymn books. But beneath the self-congratulation, the reform movement was riddled with contradictions. It championed morality but ignored poverty, preached purity but depended on hysteria. Many of its leaders came from comfortable middle-class backgrounds, women who had never seen a factory, a slum, or the inside of a chemist's back room. They blamed weakness of character where there was really weakness of circumstance. Addiction for them was not a symptom of despair but a sign of sin. Yet for all their faults, the reformers did succeed in changing the conversation. Their relentless campaigns forced the public to see addiction not as private shame but as a national issue. They pushed doctors, politicians, and newspapers to acknowledge that something had gone terribly wrong with the age's faith in science and self-control. They were loud, self-righteous, and often wrong, but they were effective. By the mid-1910s, anti-drug activism had become as fashionable as philanthropy. Fundraising teas and luncheons replaced polite gossip with moral fervour. Wealthy hostesses boasted about how many addicts they had helped reform, often by sending them to facilities that resembled monasteries run by stern nurses. In a final flourish of Edwardian irony, some of these reformed patients later returned home to discover that their prescribed sedatives contained, or you guessed it, morphine. Still, the crusade had done its work. What had begun as scattered concern had become a national obsession. The white scourge was now a full-blown moral emergency, complete with parades, sermons, and slogans. Society could now reassure itself that, after a few meetings and a few more speeches, the problem was under control. It wasn't. But the British public didn't need actual solutions, just the comforting illusion that they had taken the moral high ground. And so the temperance parades marched on, their brass bands drowning out the quieter, more complicated truth. By the time moral crusaders were marching through London with banners and hymns, the pharmaceutical companies that had started it all were doing something far less theatrical. They were quietly tiptoeing out the back door. The once proud heralds of scientific salvation began scrubbing their labels, revising their catalogues, and pretending that they had never heard of heroin. The miracle medicine that had cured everything from coughs to heartbreak was now an awkward embarrassment, the X nobody wanted to talk about. In the early 1900s, beer and its competitors had been the rock stars of chemistry. Their advertisements filled newspapers with claims of modern marvels and safe substitutes for morphine. Their factories were temples of progress, producing tidy glass vials stamped with imperial confidence. But as the headlines grew darker and the medical journals more alarmed, enthusiasm turned to unease. Doctors were whispering words like dependency, and the public was asking questions, and nothing unsettles a pharmaceutical empire faster than a customer who starts reading the fine print. At first, Bayer tried to ride out the storm. The company issued reassuring statements. Heroin remains entirely safe when used as directed, which by that point was the same defence offered by whiskey distillers and arsenic face cream manufacturers. But denial became harder to maintain when medical journals, previously their best friends, began publishing studies on habit formation and withdrawal distress. Every physician with a shaky conscience suddenly remembered how many bottles they'd prescribed. The public trust that had made heroin a global success began to crumble. The change didn't happen with a bang, but with a silence. By 1913, advertisements that had once proudly featured the word heroin began to look different. The name started vanishing from product lists. Catalogues that had showcased Bayer's heroin syrup were reissued with vaguer titles like soothing cough elixir. Labels were redesigned with elegant fonts that emphasized scientific precision, while quietly omitting what the science actually was. It was a rebrand in slow motion, less confession than camouflage. Pharmaceutical marketing departments turned into crisis managers. Internal memos, the Edwardian version of frantic telegrams, circulated between offices in London, Berlin, and New York. Public perception unfavourable suggest alternative phrasing. And so heroin was replaced by phrases like powerful sedative, modern analgesic, or the latest pharmaceutical innovation. The same bottles stayed on the shelves. They just spoke in euphemisms. It was marketing repentance by omission. Other companies followed suit. Chemists who once advertised heroin as a gift from science began describing it as a specialized compound for controlled use. When that didn't work, they pivoted entirely, promoting aspirin and codeine as the new safe modern options. Heroin's fall from grace was so swift that it became almost comical. Only a few years earlier it had been the crown jewel of the pharmaceutical world. Now it was a PR ghost. Or, as one historian later quipped, suddenly the miracle medicine wasn't returning calls. The public, meanwhile, was undergoing its own transformation. The same people who once swore by their cough remedies began treating them like ticking bombs. Households quietly discarded old bottles, chemists hid unsold stock in the back room, and polite society pretended that everyone had always known heroin was dangerous. It was a collective act of historical amnesia. Nobody wanted to remember the years when addiction had been chic, prescribed and gift-wrapped by science. Advertising itself adapted with whiplash speed. The Edwardian aesthetic of purity and progress gave way to a new tone of cautious professionalism. Posters once filled with angels and golden rays of light now featured stern men in lab coats pointing at charts. Tested, regulated, and doctor-approved became the new holy trinity of marketing language. pharmaceutical art went from celestial to clinical overnight. If you didn't know better, you'd think medicine had suddenly become modest. Bayer, sensing the cultural shift, poured its resources into a safer success story: aspirin. The company promoted it as the rational, trustworthy face of modern chemistry, clean, sober, and untainted by scandal. Aspirin didn't make you euphoric, it just made your headache go away. That, suddenly, was a selling point. The transition was so effective that by the end of the decade, most people associated Bayer not with heroin, but with the harmless little white tablets that seemed incapable of sin. The empire had reinvented itself, one pill at a time, but the erasure was almost too perfect. By the early 1910s, a person could walk into a pharmacy and see the ghost of heroin everywhere: the redesigned bottles, the vague advertisements, the evasive sales clerks. It was as if the entire medical industry had agreed to a silent pact: forget the name, keep the profits. Even when early government regulations arrived, such as the 1916 Defence of the Realm Act, which began restricting narcotics, most of the damage had already been done. The companies didn't need to be told to stop, they had already quietly buried the evidence beneath layers of new formulations. Behind closed doors, though, the reckoning was brutal. Sales reports dropped. Doctors began returning stock. The same journals that had once printed glowing reviews of heroin's gentle virtues were now filled with obituaries of physicians who died from their own prescriptions. The reputational damage was contagious, and pharmaceutical firms knew better than anyone that contagion spreads fastest when people talk. So they simply changed the conversation. By the eve of the First World War, heroin's name had all but vanished from polite print. The drug still existed, quietly, clinically, and under supervision, but its glamorous, angel-winged advertising days were over. The age of innocence in medicine had ended, not with a confession, but with a cover-up. And perhaps that was the most Edwardian ending possible. An era that had believed so deeply in appearances solved its greatest embarrassment the only way it knew how, by pretending it had never happened. The miracle cure had become the family scandal no one mentioned at dinner. By 1916, Britain had spent 2 decades pretending that its addiction problem was either exaggerated, imported, or someone else's fault. But denial only works until the tax receipts start looking suspicious. The government, which had happily profited from opium exports and taxed morphine-based tonics, finally came to a belated realization. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was not ideal that one could buy heroin with the same ease as barley sweets. Thus began Britain's first awkward dance with drug legislation, a mix of moral panic, wartime pragmatism, and bureaucratic confusion so profound that it could only be described as politely panicked progress. The spark came from war, not mercy. The First World War had transformed every aspect of British life, including its relationship with medicine. Morphine and heroin were indispensable on the battlefield, miracle painkillers for men shattered by machine guns and shrapnel, but their efficiency had an unfortunate side effect. Soldiers returning from the front were often just as dependent on their medicine as they were on their ration cards. The military began noticing the problem first, not in hospitals, but in barracks. Men who had been heroes in the trenches were now quietly stealing from medical stores. Officers who had once praised morphine as the soldier's salvation began muttering that perhaps it was a bit too salvational. At the same time, civilian use had spun out of control. The chemists who once served society ladies and factory workers alike were now doing brisk business with anyone who could afford a few shillings. Morphine tablets were sold openly, and heroin cough mixtures still sat innocently in shop windows, waiting for the next worried mother or sleepless clerk. It wasn't illegal yet, but it was starting to look embarrassing. Enter the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA, of 1916, a sprawling wartime law originally designed to control everything from press censorship to pub hours. Hidden among its many clauses was a modest addition: restrictions on the possession and distribution of habit-forming drugs. It was Britain's first true narcotics law, though at the time no one called it that. It was less a coherent policy than an act of public relations, a signal that the government had finally noticed the moral crusaders, the newspaper outrage, and the nervous doctors. DORA's new rules required that morphine, heroin, and cocaine could only be dispensed by a doctor's prescription. Chemists were told to keep detailed records, list quantities sold, and refuse suspicious customers, though what suspicious meant was left to interpretation. The legislation didn't ban the drugs, it simply wrapped them in paperwork, bureaucracy, and guilt. But for an age addicted to appearances, that was enough. Heroin could now continue its existence under a new identity, respectable, regulated, and quietly shameful. Of course, enforcement was another story, The police were still struggling to tell the difference between cough syrup and contraband. Doctors, already complicit in the problem, were now the de facto gatekeepers of legality. The same prescription pads that had once unleashed the epidemic were now the keys to controlling it. Many physicians resented the implication that they'd been irresponsible. Others simply ignored the new rules altogether. As one exasperated health official later noted, the British medical man does not take kindly to being supervised. The law also produced an entirely new breed of criminal, the unauthorised addict. Before 1916, addiction had been considered a moral or medical issue. After DORA, it became a legal one. The irony was exquisite. Thousands who had become dependent through medical treatment now found themselves technically in violation of wartime law. A man could serve his country, lose a limb, and still be fined for possessing the medicine that kept him functioning. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece of misplaced virtue. But to the government, appearances mattered more than nuance. Parliamentarians congratulated themselves for cleaning up the streets, though most addicts were still quietly dozing themselves at home. The reformers cheered. The newspapers celebrated Britain's newfound moral hygiene, and the pharmaceutical companies, ever adaptable, simply pivoted to new markets and new euphemisms. They replaced the scandalous word heroin with respectable alternatives: sedative powder, digestive aid, night rest compound. In other words, the drug didn't disappear, it just changed its name tag. Despite its flaws, the 1916 law did mark a turning point. For the first time, Britain acknowledged that some substances were too dangerous to be left to the free market. It also set the stage for future global cooperation. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, would build on these early steps, creating international drug control agreements that still define policy today. The Edwardians, however, had no idea what they had started. They thought they were tidying up an embarrassing moral issue, not inventing the framework for a century of legal complexity. The unintended consequence was cultural as much as legal. DORA ended an era of blithe confidence in science, that blind faith that every chemical innovation was inherently good. The Edwardian dream of progress had been built on the assumption that knowledge alone could save humanity. The morphine and heroin saga proved otherwise. Knowledge without restraint, it turned out, could be as destructive as ignorance. Still, Britain congratulated itself on its newfound virtue. Editorials praised the government for protecting the people from their own weaknesses. Speeches in Parliament hailed the moral triumph of the law. And across the country, chemists obediently filed new ledgers while quietly serving the same customers as before. Only now with a raised eyebrow and a whisper. The curtain had closed on the age of innocent addiction, but the actors were still on stage. In the end, DORA was less a revolution than a confession. It admitted what everyone already knew, but no one had dared say. The miracle medicines had gone too far. Britain had finally realised that selling heroin like breath mints might be a bad idea. When the Defence of the Realm Act tightened its bureaucratic grip on Britain's pharmacies and the heroin haze began to clear, the silence that followed was eerie. The country congratulated itself for its moral victory. The tabloids had new wars to cover, the reformers had new causes to scold, but behind closed curtains, an entire generation was quietly unravelling. For every flamboyant addict exposed in the papers, there were thousands more who simply disappeared into the background of post-war Britain. Patients who had once followed their doctor's orders, who had taken their nerve powders and soothing syrups exactly as prescribed, and who now found themselves stranded without them. These were not the fallen or the criminal, they were the ordinary, teachers, clerks, widows, soldiers, and especially women, whose supposed delicacy had made them perfect targets for pharmaceutical cures. The war had ended, the drugs had been restricted, but dependency doesn't read legislation. Withdrawal in 1916 had no name, no diagnosis, and no sympathy. Doctors barely understood it, and patients were too ashamed to admit it. Those who tried to stop cold found themselves racked with chills, insomnia, panic, and a despair that seemed to hollow out the soul. Some thought they were dying, others thought they were going mad, and in a sense they were, victims not of moral failure, but of medical progress with a very short attention span. The cure, it turned out, was more chronic than the condition. For women, the suffering carried a special sting of irony. Throughout the Edwardian years, heroin and morphine had been marketed as guardians of femininity, gentle tonics for the fragile and refined. The doctor's prescription was a symbol of respectability, a reassurance that their exhaustion was not weakness, but a medical condition. When regulation arrived, it took that comfort away overnight. Suddenly, these women were not delicate patients, but potential offenders. A medicine that had once been an emblem of gentility became an embarrassment best hidden in a drawer. Many continued their treatment in secret, finding sympathetic chemists or black market suppliers who still sold small quantities for medical use. Others simply endured withdrawal with stoic silence, too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening. Diaries from the period record women describing nervous decline, spells of restlessness, and a return of the old weakness, euphemisms for what we now recognise as withdrawal and dependency. Their doctors, equally lost, often prescribed yet another sedative to calm their symptoms. The wheel turned again. Men suffered too, though their silence took a different form. Soldiers returning from the trenches, many still using morphine for pain or trauma, faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't admit dependency without risking their reputation or their pensions, and so they carried on, rationing their remaining doses, visiting multiple doctors under false names, or simply turning to alcohol when the medicines ran out. The result was a generation numbed not just by war, but by its supposed cure. The most tragic cases were those who had no idea what was happening to them. Families watched loved ones waste away, complaining of weakness, anxiety, and mysterious pains. Without the language of addiction, these symptoms were often labelled neurasthenia or melancholia. Some were sent to sanatoriums, others to asylums. There, denied their drugs, they endured the full, brutal force of withdrawal under the guise of rest cures. Doctors observed the shaking and sweating as moral regeneration. Patients called it hell. Society had moved on. The newspapers that once sensationalized heroin addiction now ignored its aftermath. There were no headlines for quiet suffering, no parades for those who endured in silence. The reformers, having declared victory, shifted their attention to new crusades, alcohol again, or prostitution, or the moral decline of the jazz generation. Britain was too busy rebuilding itself after the war to look back at the bodies it had stepped over on the way to enlightenment. The silence extended to medicine as well. Addiction was an uncomfortable topic for a profession still nursing its pride. The doctors who had caused it couldn't easily become its saviours. Many simply reclassified their dependent patients as chronically nervous and moved on. The first real attempts at understanding withdrawal scientifically wouldn't come until the 1920s, long after the Edwardian generation had suffered in obscurity. And yet, for all the suffering, something profound had shifted in the social fabric. The blind faith in science that had defined the pre-war decades was gone. The Edwardians had believed that progress could be bottled, that modernity could be swallowed with a teaspoon. The aftermath proved otherwise. The body, it turned out, was not a machine that could be endlessly adjusted without consequence. The lost generation of addicts, the quiet victims of prescriptions and promises, became a cautionary ghost haunting the age of modern medicine. It was also, in a strange way, the beginning of empathy. The same society that had once dismissed addicts as weak began slowly to see them as patients. The conversations were clumsy, the science primitive, but the idea that dependency was a disease, not a sin, began to take root. Out of tragedy came the first fragile shoots of understanding. By the early 1920s, Britain's heroin generation had largely faded from view. Some recovered, many did not. Their bottles were emptied, their stories forgotten. Their suffering folded neatly into the margins of history, but they left behind a quiet legacy, a warning etched into the foundations of modern pharmacology. The Edwardians had learned too late that progress without conscience is just another form of ignorance. They had treated pain by replacing it with dependence, sold relief as luxury, and called suffering science. When the miracle wore off, what remained was not triumph but exhaustion, a nation nursing a hangover from its own enlightenment. By the early 20s, Britain congratulated itself for having solved its heroin problem. The miracle drug was gone from shop windows, the moral reformers had moved on, and polite society could once again breathe, or at least cough politely into its handkerchief. Because as heroin faded into legal obscurity, two new addictions stepped in to fill the silence. One came in a crystal glass, the other in a slim white cylinder, and both were conveniently taxable. It turned out that the human appetite for escape doesn't vanish just because Parliament passes a law, it simply changes packaging. With heroin restricted to prescriptions and morphine losing its shine, Britain discovered the modern twin pillars of public comfort: gin and cigarettes. They were cheaper, louder, and infinitely easier to justify. Society quit one addiction by starting two more. Progress. Let's start with gin, the old national sweetheart. Gin had never truly gone away. It had merely been overshadowed by its chemical cousins. When the narcotic haze lifted, Londoners returned to their first love with open arms and empty glasses. Pubs that had once suffered under temperance sermons now found their seats full again, and distilleries cranked up production to meet demand. Soldiers returning from the trenches wanted something to dull the memories that didn't come with a medical bill or a moral lecture. Gin was perfect, fast, legal, and refreshingly straightforward about its intentions. This was no longer the ruinous gin craze of the 18th century. It was something more sophisticated, more modern. The post-war British public wasn't collapsing into gutters. It was drinking in jazz clubs, hotel bars, and fashionable lounges. The Roaring Twenties were exactly that, loud, defiant, and half-drunk on optimism. And gin, once the shame of the poor, became the signature of chic rebellion. Cocktails imported from America, martinis, gimlet, and the oddly named corpse reviver turned intoxication into an art form. The empire might have been wobbling, but it could still mix a fine drink. Meanwhile, another habit was rising from the ashes, quite literally. Cigarettes, once a novelty, became the new universal accessory of modernity. Smoking had existed for centuries, but the Edwardians had preferred pipes and snuff, habits of leisure and class. The First World War changed everything. Cigarettes were light, portable, and morale-boosting. Soldiers were issued to them in rations. Generals endorsed them as a comfort of the trenches. It's hard to overstate their cultural takeover. By the 1920s, lighting a cigarette wasn't just a pastime, it was a statement of style, of independence, of being fashionably unbothered by the future. Manufacturers pounced. Tobacco companies, watching the opiate scandal implode, recognised an opportunity. Be addictive but never apologise for it. They built brands around glamour and modernity. Posters featured soldiers, debutantes and Hollywood stars all doing the same elegant thing, exhaling sophistication. For steadier nerves, promised one ad. For a clearer mind, claimed another. The irony, of course, was thick enough to choke on. Britain had just learned that nerve tonics were poison and immediately replaced them with something you could literally set on fire and inhale. The government for once had no objections. Unlike heroin, cigarettes and gin came with reliable tax revenue. They also kept the public reasonably content, which was no small feat in a country still rationing hope after the Great War. Addiction, rebranded as recreation, had become patriotic. Drink and smoke, but do it with dignity. That was the unspoken motto of the age. Doctors might frown at excess, But no one wanted another moral crusade. And make no mistake, these new habits weren't confined to men. Women, who'd once been confined to morphine-laced ladies' remedies, now claimed cigarettes as a badge of liberation. The suffragette generation had fought for the vote. Now they fought for the right to light up in public. Cigarettes became a symbol of modern womanhood, rebellious, sleek, and defiantly unfeminine by Victorian standards. Magazine spreads depicted elegant women smoking with confidence, under slogans like, "You've come a long way, baby." Though that particular line would arrive decades later, the sentiment was already smouldering. The social meaning of addiction had flipped. Heroin had been hidden, whispered about and shamed. Cigarettes and gin, by contrast, were worn like fashion accessories. You didn't hide your vices anymore, you accessorized them. The middle classes, always eager to distinguish themselves from both the Bohemian and the destitute, made indulgence respectable. Cigarette holders became jewellery. Cocktail shakers became status symbols. Being slightly inebriated or lightly buzzed was no longer scandalous. It was charming. What makes this transition so perfectly British is how seamlessly it turned morality into marketing. The country that had once lectured the world on self-control now built an empire of smoky lounges and liquor advertisements. Posters of angels and purity gave way to bold typography and seductive silhouettes. Addiction hadn't been abolished, it had simply changed clothes. The chemist's bottle had become the bartender's shaker. Of course, not everyone saw it as progress. A few cautious doctors warned that cigarettes might not be quite as harmless as advertised. Early studies hinted at respiratory irritation. Reformers fretted that post-war Britain was drowning its trauma in drink and smoke. But the warnings were easy to ignore. After years of death and destruction, people wanted to live, even if it meant slowly killing themselves in comfort. The cigarette was cheaper than therapy, and gin came without a prescription. By the end of the 1920s, the heroin epidemic was a fading memory, but the country had simply traded one dependency for another, or rather two. Public health officials would spend the next century dealing with the fallout. Yet in the optimistic glow of interwar Britain, no one cared. Addiction was no longer a tragedy, it was a lifestyle. In the end, that was the Edwardian legacy, not the elimination of vice, but its evolution. They had turned chemical dependency into culture, pain relief into ritual, and coping into commerce. Britain hadn't conquered addiction, it had modernised it. By the 1920s, Britain's grand experiment with chemical optimism had finally crashed, leaving a hangover that stretched from hospital wards to Parliament. The doctors who had once prescribed heroin like herbal tea now faced the uncomfortable task of figuring out what had gone wrong. It wasn't just an ethical reckoning, it was a scientific one. The medical profession, humbled, shaken, and slightly embarrassed, began the slow, awkward process of turning addiction from a moral failure into a medical field. Science, in short, advanced, mostly by cleaning up its own mess. At first, the transformation was reluctant. Many physicians were still clinging to old Victorian notions of weak nerves and moral temperament. Admitting that dependency was a physical, chemical process meant admitting that medicine itself had created it, and doctors, as a rule, are allergic to self-blame. But as more studies trickled in, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The body, it turned out, was not merely fond of morphine and heroin, it was rewired by them. Nerves adapted, tolerance built, and withdrawal wasn't weakness, but biology rebelling against sudden deprivation. This was revolutionary thinking for the time. The late Edwardian and early interwar physicians began to map the terrain of the human nervous system in earnest. Laboratories that had once produced cough syrup now turned to research. The language shifted from moral to medical. Vice became habit, habit became descendance, and eventually dependence became addiction. For the first time, the conversation moved from pulpits to microscopes. In 1926, the British government commissioned a study known as the Rolleston Report, a milestone in the history of addiction science. Headed by Sir Humphrey Rolleston, The committee gathered doctors, pharmacists and scientists to study how addiction should be treated. Their findings were surprisingly compassionate for the era. Addiction, they concluded, was a disease, not a crime, not a sin, and not something to be cured through moral lectures. Patients, they said, should not be punished for their dependence but managed with care, including continued maintenance doses if necessary. It was the first time a government had officially recognised addiction as a medical condition. This was a seismic shift. For centuries, the treatment of addiction had oscillated between moral scolding and confinement. The Roller Stone Report quietly upended that tradition. Instead of punishment, it proposed understanding. Instead of shame, supervision. And instead of sermons, science. It marked the birth of modern pharmacology's conscience, an acknowledgement that medicine could harm as easily as it could heal. But make no mistake, this progress didn't come without irony. The same laboratories that had once sold safe heroin now became the pioneers of addiction research. Pharmaceutical firms, eager to restore their reputations, began funding studies into narcotic behaviour and physiological habituation. It was, in essence, a public apology written in Latin and data tables. One could almost hear the corporate motto, "We deeply regret your addiction. Please enjoy our new line of safer opiates." Meanwhile, in hospitals and universities, a new generation of doctors approached addiction with curiosity instead of fear. They studied withdrawal, mapped the chemical pathways of morphine in the bloodstream, and documented the effects of long-term use. Early experiments were crude, measuring pulse rates, sweating and tremors, but they laid the foundation for pharmacology as we know it. Science, having created chaos through confidence, was learning humility through observation. Public health too began to shift. Doctors started to talk about prevention. Educational campaigns emerged warning of habit-forming drugs, and medical schools added lectures on dependency. The same posters that once depicted angelic nurses offering miracle tonics now showed skeletons clutching syringes. Medicine was turning its former sins into cautionary tales. Every new textbook included a chapter on addiction, an implicit reminder that the profession's halo had once been forged in heroin fumes. In the background, psychology was emerging as a partner in the study of addiction. Sigmund Freud, who had once personally experimented with cocaine with predictably messy results, had helped popularise the idea that the mind played as much a role as the body. His successors built on that insight. Addiction wasn't just a chemical problem, it was emotional, social and psychological. The addict wasn't merely a body in withdrawal, but a person seeking relief, meaning or escape. For a society that had spent a century equating morality with biology, this was a radical revelation. By the 30s, Britain had one of the most progressive addiction policies in the world. Addicts could receive controlled doses from doctors under supervision, a humane alternative to criminalisation. It wasn't perfect, but it was compassionate. Other countries, particularly the United States, went in the opposite direction, turning addiction into a crime rather than a condition. Britain, ironically, became the sober one at the party, though it had arrived late and smelling faintly of chloroform. Still, progress came slowly. Old prejudices lingered, and the medical establishment's newfound humility didn't erase its earlier arrogance. But the lessons were learned, at least partially. Every future drug, from barbiturates to tranquilizers to antibiotics, would face scrutiny about side effects and dependency. Regulations, clinical trials, dosage standards, all the bureaucratic caution we now associate with medicine, were born from the Edwardian disaster. Science had been forced to grow up. The heroin age had begun with boundless faith in chemistry and ended with a grudging respect for biology. The doctors of the 20s no longer promised miracles, they promised management. And perhaps that was the truest sign of maturity. The age of scientific innocence had passed, leaving behind a new kind of medicine, one that understood that the human body could not be bullied into perfection, only coaxed toward balance. In the end, the Edwardian heroin saga did more for modern medicine than any triumphal discovery. It taught the profession that progress without humility leads to poison, that miracles often come with fine print, and that the most dangerous drug of all is certainty. History has a remarkable talent for rewriting its own scandals, polishing them until they fit neatly into the story it wants to tell. And nowhere was that truer than with the Edwardian heroin users. In their own time, they were fashionable, even aspirational, paragons of refinement armed with elegant prescriptions and delicate ailments. But by the 1920s, as Britain rebranded itself for a more sober modern age, those same people became the ghosts of moral decline. Yesterday's wellness influencer had become today's cautionary tale. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the early days of reform, most people preferred to forget that addiction had ever been respectable. The newspapers that once praised miracle cures now printed sermons about sin. Society performed a collective amnesia act so convincing that even the chemist seemed to believe it. The heroin user, once depicted as fragile and genteel, was now reimagined as degenerate, a warning rather than a victim. The message was clear. It wasn't us, it was them. For women, this rewriting was particularly cruel. During the Edwardian era, they had been prescribed heroin and morphine for everything from nerves to female troubles. Their dependency had been a medical construction, a symptom of how male doctors saw female fragility, but once the drugs fell out of favour, the narrative shifted. Now these women were portrayed as fallen, as if addiction had been a moral failure rather than a prescribed condition. Newspapers ran stories about society ladies ensnared by vice, using language that dripped with pity and judgment in equal measure. It was easier for the public to believe that addiction was a sin than to admit it had been a science. So heroin users became caricatures, pale, tragic figures in cautionary pamphlets and moral plays. The reformers who had once hosted luncheons about purity now used their portraits as examples of what happens when refinement forgets restraint. The irony was staggering. Many of those moralists had once sipped the same tonics themselves. But history loves a neat villain, and it doesn't check the medicine cabinet before assigning roles. Literature, always eager to mirror society's neuroses, joined the moral makeover. The heroin generation became fodder for fiction, tragic, haunted souls who embodied the decay of old-world elegance. Novelists portrayed them as ghostly remnants of the pre-war elite, trapped between velvet drapes and empty bottles. A generation earlier, addiction had been romanticised in poetry as transcendence. Now it was treated as punishment. The tone had shifted from silk to shadow. In the arts, too, heroin's former glamour curdled into shame. The Bohemians, who had once claimed narcotics as creative muses, were recast as cautionary parables. Painters who died young of mysterious ailments were posthumously diagnosed with addiction, and their work was interpreted as the visual proof of moral decay. Society needed these ghosts, not to understand them, but to reassure itself that it had evolved. Even medicine participated in the rewrite. Doctors who had prescribed heroin freely now spoke of addiction as a disease of weak constitution. Journals that had once described morphine as a blessing for the nervous began warning about predispositions toward degeneracy. The profession was rewriting its own past with surgical precision. The same hand that had once written prescriptions now redacted them. What emerged was a moral hierarchy of addiction. The poor addict remained a problem, the middle-class addict a scandal, and the upper-class addict, once the icon of modern wellness, became a cautionary ghost haunting moral lectures. Heroin had become the shorthand for self-destruction, a lesson neatly packaged for a post-war nation eager to rebuild its identity around discipline and decency. The public's memory of the heroin era hardened into a familiar story, a period of decadence punished by consequence. It fit perfectly with the broader narrative of the Edwardian age, an empire at its most dazzling just before the fall. The addicted duchess, the weary poet, the trembling soldier, they became symbols of a civilization that had overdosed on its own progress. The moral was irresistible. We flew too close to the syringe, and science melted our wings. By the 1930s, heroin use itself had largely vanished from daily life, but its shadow lingered in culture. Films and magazines occasionally referenced the vice of the past, always in hushed tones. Addiction became the new Gothic, a symbol of inner corruption and doomed beauty. What the Victorians had done with ghosts and lunatics, the moderns now did with addicts, made them metaphors. They were no longer patients or people, they were warnings. Yet beneath the judgment, something else began to stir, a trace of empathy. The first addiction clinics, born from the Rolleston Report's recommendations, began treating patients not as sinners but as sufferers. The very act of rehabilitation, of trying to understand rather than punish, signalled a shift. Society might still moralise, but medicine was beginning to humanise. Even journalists, once addicted to scandal, started to write with curiosity instead of condemnation. A slow cultural detox had begun. The Edwardian heroin users, though long gone, left behind a strange dual legacy. In memory, they were both villains and victims, symbols of arrogance and objects of pity. They represented an era that had trusted too much in chemistry and too little in caution. But they also laid the groundwork for something better, a world where addiction could finally be seen as part of the human condition, not a moral defect. By the time history was done rewriting them, their lives had become lessons, their pain recycled into progress. And while society still loves to moralise its mistakes, the Edwardians had taught an enduring truth, that every era's miracle cure eventually becomes the next generation's moral fable. History has a wicked sense of humour. It doesn't repeat itself exactly, it just updates the packaging. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the strange, shimmering reflection between Edwardian heroin culture and today's wellness and beauty industries. The slogans may have changed, the bottles are sleeker, and the influencers have Wi-Fi, but the promises are hauntingly familiar. Instant calm, radiant energy, and total self-reinvention, all for the low, low price of your long-term health. Replace heroin tonic with detox smoothie, and the marketing hasn't aged a day. In the early 1900s, the heroine craze sold purity through chemistry. Today, the wellness industry sells purity through consumption. The language is eerily alike. Then it was soothing, natural, and scientifically proven to restore vitality. Now it's organic, clean, and clinically tested for inner glow. Both trade in the same emotional currency, the promise that you can buy control over your body and your anxieties. The Edwardians had pharmacists. We have wellness influencers. The tone hasn't changed, only the lighting. The Edwardian woman who once sipped her soothing syrup to calm her nerves has been reborn as the modern consumer clutching her adaptogenic latte. Both are told that stress is an illness and that relief comes in a bottle. The marketing, then as now, wraps dependency in empowerment. "Take control of your health," cried the Edwardian adverts, right before offering a heroin-laced cough drop. "Take control of your wellness," cries the Instagram ad, right before suggesting a $75 supplement with no medical oversight. The cycle is complete, self-care as soft addiction. Even aesthetics follow the same curious curve. Edwardian society glamorized fragility, pale skin, thin frames, and that faint, languid look that suggested both refinement and quiet suffering. Sound familiar? A century later, the fashion world reinvented it as heroin chic, a term so on the nose it barely counts as metaphor. The hollow cheeks, the tired eyes, the too thin elegance. It was the same aesthetic of exhaustion once praised in 1905, now reborn in glossy magazines of the 90s. What had once been the byproduct of opiates became a look you could achieve with coffee, cigarettes, and lighting. The Edwardians didn't call it an aesthetic, but they lived it. Delicacy was social currency. Being faint, pale, and sensitive signalled refinement. Today we sell the same message under the guise of wellness minimalism. We post images of sleek morning routines and clean girl looks, all beige, effortless, and faintly malnourished. The Edwardian fainting couch has been replaced by the yoga mat, but the principle remains the same: virtue through visible restraint. Whether it's corsets or calorie tracking, the goal is still purity, just with better branding. Even the language of medicine has migrated. The Edwardians believed in tonics, elixirs, and restoratives. We prefer supplements, boosters, and cleanses. Both imply deficiency, that something essential is missing from you, and only this product can restore your natural perfection. The tone of authority is identical, part scientific, part spiritual, entirely profitable. Doctor recommended has become doctor inspired, and both phrases mean equally little. And just like their Edwardian predecessors, today's consumers find themselves swimming in contradiction. The very culture that tells us to relax also sells the anxiety that fuels its own market. The Edwardians were told that modern life was too fast, too stressful, too stimulating. Sound familiar? So they reached for a remedy. The difference is that our remedies now come with Wi-Fi-enabled blenders. When an age defines itself by exhaustion, there will always be someone ready to bottle relief. The obsession with natural health is another echo. The Edwardians trusted chemistry because it looked modern. We trust nature because it looks ancient. But in both cases, the trust is blind. Their bottles had Latin on the label. Ours have eucalyptus leaves. The effect is the same. Aesthetic reassurance in place of understanding. Non-addictive, said the 1905 ads. Non-toxic, says the 225 packaging. Both, of course, depend on your definition of truth. There's also the shared illusion of individual mastery. The Edwardian addict didn't see herself as dependent. She saw herself as managing her constitution. The modern wellness devotee doesn't see herself as compulsive. She sees herself as optimizing her health. In both eras, control is the product being sold, the sense that you can outthink biology. It's the oldest marketing trick in the book. Sell people back the confidence your culture took from them. And while Edwardian doctors eventually faced a moral reckoning, our digital successors, the influencers, supplement gurus, and wellness CEOs, enjoy a freedom their predecessors could only dream of. The Edwardians at least needed a prescription pad. Modern marketers need only a ring light and an affiliate link. We may not have chemists dispensing heroin lozenges anymore, but we do have wellness brands shipping miracle mushroom gummies from warehouses that look suspiciously like Edwardian opium factories with better ventilation. This isn't to say all progress is illusion, only that history's favourite trick is to repackage its vices as virtues. The Edwardians believed in chemical purity. We believe in lifestyle purity. They sought calm in opiates. We seek it in mindfulness apps that charge $15 a month. Their drugstores were mahogany shrines to self-improvement. Ours are minimalist websites with soft focus images of lavender sprigs. The ingredients have changed, but the formula is eternal. Dissatisfaction, repackaged as a shopping opportunity. Perhaps that's the true legacy of the heroin age. Not the drug itself, but the mindset it revealed. That progress always comes with a sales pitch, and that every cure begins as a trend. The Edwardians look to science to save them from modern life. We look to wellness to save us from the same. Both find eventually that you can't detox your way out of being human. Every era believes itself wiser than the last. The Victorians thought they'd perfected morality. The Edwardians thought they'd perfected science. And in a way they had, at least until their brilliance began eating them alive one teaspoon at a time. The heroin age of Edwardian London ended not with a revolution, but with a quiet, narcotized sigh, a cautionary tale dressed in satin and respectability. Yet from that glittering wreckage emerged something more enduring, a complicated legacy that reshaped how we think about medicine, addiction, and the fragile line between glamour and decay. The Edwardians had set out to conquer pain, physical, emotional, existential. It was the noble mission of an empire that believed discomfort was a solvable problem. Pain, after all, was for the poor, the uneducated, and the uncivilized. The refined classes would simply outthink it. Science, they believed, could polish the human condition the same way it polished silverware. And for a while it seemed to work. Heroin soothed nerves, calmed anxieties, cured coughs, and conveniently quieted any inconvenient truths about human frailty. But the true legacy of the heroin craze wasn't the drug itself, it was the mirror it held up to civilization. The Edwardians learned, the hard way, that progress without humility becomes poison. Their faith in chemistry revealed just how easily enlightenment turns into delusion when profit and prestige are involved. Medicine, once a calling, had flirted with marketing, science had become a salesman, and society, dazzled by the promise of modernity, had bought every bottle. The heroin age also reshaped how the world thought about women's health, though not in the way one might hope. Edwardian doctors, convinced that women were fragile creatures ruled by their wombs, prescribed heroin and morphine as tools of balance. Pain, exhaustion, even sadness, all were treated with narcotics, conveniently reinforcing the idea that a woman's body was both mysterious and in need of male management. The result was not liberation, but sedation. The so-called delicate sex became the first mass casualties of overprescribed medicine. When the scandal finally broke, society didn't apologise, it rewrote. The same women once praised for their refinement were later portrayed as cautionary ghosts, pale, hysterical and weak-willed. Their addictions, though medically induced, were reimagined as moral failure. It was a betrayal disguised as decency. The Edwardian woman, who had once embodied the grace of the empire, became its shadow, proof supposedly of what happens when progress forgets virtue. And in that rewriting lay a centuries-long habit of blaming women for the very systems that exploited them. Yet even through hypocrisy, the heroin age forced medicine to grow up. Doctors began to see addiction not as sin, but as science, a messy human flaw that needed understanding rather than punishment. It took decades, but out of Edwardian excess came the seeds of modern pharmacology, addiction studies, and medical ethics. The profession learned, slowly, painfully, that trust must be earned, not advertised. Every clinical trial, every side effect warning, every prescription label that reads "may cause dependency" traces its lineage back to a London chemist's counter, where a bottle of heroin tonic once gleamed. Culturally, the heroin craze left behind something stranger, a paradox of allure and disgust that still shapes how we think about drugs today. Addiction became both repulsive and romantic. The image of the doomed, beautiful addict, fragile, artistic, tragic, was born from Edwardian decadence and never really died. From jazz musicians in smoky clubs to tortured poets, the aesthetic of beautiful ruin owes its origin to the era that turned chemistry into couture. The Edwardians didn't just medicalize addiction, they glamorized it, then recoiled from their own reflection. And that contradiction, the fusion of elegance and decay, is perhaps the heroin age's truest ghost. The same empire that built libraries, hospitals, and railways also built the world's first industrial drug market. It brought sanitation and narcotics, progress and dependence, faith in science and fear of its consequences. Even as Britain prided itself on reason, it became addicted to its own illusions, that pain could be eradicated, that order could be imposed on chaos, that morality could be measured in milligrams. The echoes still linger. Our modern world inherited not just the caution, but the choreography of Edwardian addiction, the marketing gloss, the pseudoscience, the hunger for control. When we buy a miracle serum or a supplement promising calm, we're still chasing that same Edwardian dream, a life purified of discomfort. We may have traded glass vials for sleek packaging and moral lectures for influence posts, but the desire remains identical, to look and feel like life hurts less than it does. Yet in fairness, the Edwardians also left behind wisdom. They forced medicine to develop a conscience, society to confront its hypocrisy, and governments to regulate what commerce had so carelessly unleashed. Their excess created the boundaries of modern ethics, the lines between innovation and exploitation. Every warning label, every ethical code, every addiction clinic owes something to their failure. Still, their contradictions endure, a reminder that progress is never pure. The Edwardians built a world that was dazzling on the surface and quietly crumbling beneath it. Their streets glimmered with electric lights, while their nerves burned with chemical fire. They sought beauty and found dependency, sought health and found hysteria, sought enlightenment and found addiction. It's a pattern humanity has never quite escaped. We chase perfection until the side effects arrive. In the end, the legacy of Edwardian heroin is not just historical, it's philosophical. It reminds us that every age invents its own narcotic, whether chemical or cultural. For the Edwardians, it was heroin. For us, it might be dopamine, distraction, or the dream of productivity. The forms change, the craving doesn't. So when we look back on the glittering salons and their velvet secrets, we can't just sneer at their foolishness. We have to recognise ourselves in it. The Edwardians gave us elegance. Elegance gave us heroin. And heroin gave us, well, lessons we're still ignoring. Because every age, sooner or later, must confront the same intoxicating question. What price are we willing to pay to feel better than we are?